Possessed by a Dark Warrior, Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 32. Blue teleported into the main courtyard of the castle and set Taryn away from him, but refused to relinquish her right hand. He clutched it firmly in his left and battled the desire to take her far away from this realm, where she felt so unsafe and threatened, to a place where they could be alone, a place with no other males around to look upon her curves with hunger in their eyes. He scowled at every unmated male in the courtyard, his glare lingering on those who didn't immediately look away, holding their gazes until they eventually backed down and turned to leave. Beside him, Taryn was quiet, but he could feel her eyes on him, studying his face, warming his skin, heating his bones. When every male had finally turned their focus elsewhere and the dark urge to fight had faded to a more manageable level, he shifted his gaze down to her. She smiled, a small one that spoke of knowing and also satisfaction. His little dragon was pleased that he was so fiercely protective of her, had silently challenged every male present, and had won against all of them, driving them away. He flexed his fingers against her hand, locking his more tightly between hers, showing her that his protective behavior was born of more than a mere promise to keep her safe. It was born of a deep and dark possessiveness. It welled from his heart, from his most base and primal instincts as her mate. She was his, and all who gazed upon her would know it, because he would make them intimately acquainted with pain and suffering and death. He tugged her forwards, turning his black glare on the soldiers ahead of them who guarded the grand entrance of the towering castle. The males wisely kept their eyes forwards, focuses locked on a point far beyond him. It didn't stop him from snarling quietly at them as he passed, or pulling Taryn closer to him, switching sides with her so he could have his arm around her while still holding her hand, practically pinning her to his side. He was surprised he didn't send his black formal attire away and replace it with the new armor Lauren had given to him, or call his obsidian blade to his hand. Fuck, being away from her had really messed with his head and his heart, and had apparently driven him deep into his instincts as her fated male, rousing them and bringing them to a point where he felt he was beginning to lose control. He glanced down at her where she walked beside him, her footsteps faltering as she struggled to walk while held against him, her right arm pulled up by his, locked with his hand where it rested over her shoulder. It hit him that he was acting exactly as he had vowed he would never behave on finding his mate. He was behaving like a prick. But she was his. Mine. He felt it in every molecule in his body as he gazed down at her. It drummed in his blood, beat in his heart, roared in his mind. She was his. Mine. That word was a low, possessive growl that rumbled through him. It made him want to scrub a hand over his face and groan. Hadn't he told Lauren and Kiter that he would never act like this? Snarling such thoughts or saying them aloud felt stupid and cliché to him. He had said he wouldn't act like the other males he knew. But here he was, growling mine over Taryn, and getting in every unmated male's face, threatening them whether they had looked at her or not. Gods help him. He led her up to the war room, lost in his thoughts, in possessive and dangerous imaginings that had him aching to take her back to her room and stamp his claim on her. She wriggled against him, ramping up his desire as she turned his mind firmly towards thoughts of touching her again, and having her touch him. He needed her. The way her fingers toyed with his, thumb caressing and teasing his hand, and the feelings that flowed through their link, said he wasn't the only one indulging in wicked thoughts. 2 days apart was far too long. He wasn't sure how he had survived that long without touching her. He twirled her and had her pinned against the glittering pale gray stone wall of the corridor before she could even react, and had claimed her lips before she could loose a gasp. He swallowed the shocked sound as it turned into a groan, and joined that moan with one of his own as her hands came up to press against his chest, fingertips digging in hard through his black jacket. Her mouth was hot on his, desperate and wild, her kiss so fierce it made his blood catch fire. He gathered her closer, snaking his left arm around her waist, and kissed her harder, as desperate for more as she was. A sound echoed along the corridor, a dim murmur of voices coming from the closed door far to his left. The war room. The sensible part of him said to stop, but he couldn't. He needed his female, his beautiful mate. She had better control than he did, though, and pushed him back, breaking free of his lips and turning her cheek to him when he tried to kiss her again. He settled for kissing along her jaw and down her neck, his mouth watering as his fangs elongated, a different hunger rising in him as he felt her pulse hammering against his lips, beating in his chest. "Later," she whispered, and he could hear that she didn't want to stop. She wanted to continue what he had started. But the Demon Kings and his prince were waiting in the war room. For them. Blue drew down a deep breath to steady himself, closed his eyes, and focused to purge the hunger from his mind and his body, slowly clawing back control. When his need had gone from a boil to a fierce simmering in his veins, he reluctantly released Taryn and stepped back. She looked up at him, her striking violet to white eyes dark with the hunger he could still feel in her. His female needed. It was almost enough to have him lunging for her again, dragging her back against him for another kiss. Only her hand claiming his stopped him, together with her reassuring smile, one that told him she would keep that promise she had made, and as soon as the meeting was done, they would pick things back up where they had left off, which only made him want to rush the meeting. It wasn't important. So whatever they discussed might affect the future of the elf kingdom as well as the demon realms and possibly all of hell. Big deal. He closed his eyes and huffed, unimpressed with himself. His kingdom came first. He had always placed it above his own needs, and finding his mate wouldn't change that. He had a mission, and he would complete it. Nothing would stand in his way, no matter how tempting and beautiful she was. A blush rose onto her cheeks as he stared at her, probably looking like a lovesick idiot. He certainly felt like one. She tugged on his hand this time, and he obediently followed her towards the arched wooden doors of the war room. He steeled himself as they approached it, preparing to see Vale again. The male had been helpful, and seeing him with Rosalind had lessened his hatred towards Vale, but it hadn't lessened the pain he had locked up deep in his heart. He wasn't sure it was possible to heal that hurt. It would always be there, imprinted on him at a time in his life when he had been the most vulnerable, too young to shield himself against it, or no better than to idolize someone. He faltered as she reached for the doorknob, and she looked back at him, a curious frown pulling her eyebrows down over her incredible eyes. They searched his, a flicker of concern in them that her feelings backed up. Blue sucked down a deep, fortifying breath. "Is it the other prince?" she whispered and turned to face him. He nodded, because in that moment he realized that he could share anything with the female standing before him. He didn't have to hold anything back in order to protect himself, because he knew she would never hurt him. It was right there in her eyes and in the way she squeezed his hand, sympathy and tenderness flowing from her and into him through their link. "I served in his legion when he turned on his own people. I saw him kill those I called friend. But worse than that, he shattered a part of me. The part that held him aloft, like a fucking god. Idolized and adored him. Like a fucking idiot." Blue looked away from her when her eyebrows furrowed and she reached up to touch his cheek. Her hand stopped just short, but he could still feel the heat of her skin and the comfort she had meant to offer. And he cursed himself for denying himself both of those things in some ridiculous need to maintain some sort of distance between them. He didn't want there to be any distance between them, not a single drop of air, but it was hard to overcome the instinct to protect himself. He sighed and exhaled hard, and fought to let it go. Taryn had shared her pain with him, and he wanted to share his with her. He wanted her to know him. "When I joined the army, I worked hard with one goal." He opened his eyes and looked across at her, met her soft and tender gaze, felt it soothe the hurt beginning to brew inside him, tempering it. "I wanted to serve under Prince Vale. When I was placed into his legion, it was a dream come true. But it turned into a nightmare. You feel guilty that you survived. Gods, did he? I saw so many die, and I should have died too. I should not have survived, but I did, because... He sucked down another sharp breath and curled his fingers into fists as he forced the words he had always kept to himself out into the world for her to hear. Because he spared me. Her eyes widened. Blue broke away from her and shoved his fingers through his hair as he took agitated strides across the wide corridor, his heart pounding hard against his chest. He threw her a glance, caught the pity in her eyes, and growled. He looked right at me, covered in the blood of my friends, eyes wild and black, claws raised and poised to strike me down. And then he left, teleported, and I looked at the blood-soaked battlefield around me. A fight only a few had survived, my damn head spinning and ears ringing. And I knew he had spared me. He left because it was you, she whispered, and his head spun and ears rang all over again as numbness swept through him on the heels of those words. A realization that left him cold. Holy fuck. Taryn was right. Vale hadn't merely spared him. He hadn't been tired from the fight and done with it as Blue had thought. Vale wasn't that sort of male. He had never backed down from a battle, leaving before his victory was assured. He had come face to face with Blue and hadn't been able to kill him, so he had found the strength to leave. He had chosen to end the battle because of him. All of a sudden, the feeling that had always been with Blue made a whole lot of sense. Taryn was right, and he felt guilty, but that feeling ran deeper than she knew, and he had ever acknowledged. He had carried that guilt and shame with him through the centuries, a weight that had pressed down on his heart, not born of the fact he had survived Vale's attack, but born of the fact he had subconsciously known he might have been able to spare so many of his friends and comrades if he had only possessed more courage and found the strength to fight to reach Vale earlier in the battle. Thousands more might have survived. Hell, he might have been able to stop the assault from ever happening if he had been in the right place at the right time, there near Vale when he had launched the attack. He wasn't sure how to process that. He looked at the closed arched wooden doors. He wasn't sure how to proceed. Vale was in that room, waiting, aware that he was coming. How the hell was he meant to behave around him now? It had been hard enough knowing how to act after discovering that Cordula had been controlling him all those times they had fought. Now he didn't have a damn clue what he was meant to do. One thing was certain, though. He couldn't bury his head in the sand by turning away and letting the meeting proceed without him. He wasn't that fresh-faced youth anymore, the one who had tried to run away from the battle because he had been too afraid to face the male he had idolized, as that male faced his darkest hour. He had become a male who faced things head-on, never backed down from a fight, and certainly never ran from a battle. This was just another battle, and he would face it head-on too. Would take it one move at a time and adjust his strategy as he went, adapting to whatever happened. Eventually, he would win this fight and accept the things that had happened, and that there was nothing he could do to change the past. But right now, there was a bigger battle that demanded his attention, a war with a dragon that would decide the fate of Hell. "You are decided?" Taryn murmured in a soft voice, and he nodded while silently thanking her for giving him time to reach a resolution and choose his course of action. He took hold of her hand and she squeezed his, her striking eyes silently telling him that she would be there for him when he was ready to talk more about his past. It was an offer he would take her up on sooner rather than later. He needed to do it. Iolanthe would tease him if she knew, but it was time he shared the burden he had carried for too long with someone else, letting them lift some of the weight from his shoulders. Taryn was that someone. Just as she would come to share her past with him, he would share his with her, and together they would work through everything and deal with it. He led her to the doors and shoved them open with his free hand. Almost everyone in the grand war room turned away from the huge map of Hell to look at him. He took them all in with one swift glance, King Thorn of the Third Realm had brought Sable with him, and the slender black-haired huntress stood near the right corner of the table map, her golden eyes fixed on Blue, and her demon mate's left hand on her right shoulder, dark claws pressing into her black t-shirt. Blue looked up at Thorn, meeting his red eyes before they leaped to a point beside Blue. He bared his fangs at the demon, warning him to take his gaze off Terran. The male obviously sensed the threat, because he pinned his focus back on the map and tunneled his free hand through his tousled russet-brown hair, pulling it back from the dusky horns that curled from above his pointed ears, following the curve of them down to the lobe. Beyond him, on the far side of the map, King Tegan of the Second Realm preened his obsidian horns, an act he did often if the smoothness of them was anything to go by. They looked as if they had been polished, the ridges no longer visible, but other markings had been placed on them, intricate tribal carvings that were inlaid with gold. His thoughtful black gaze was the only one to have remained on the map. The impressive 7-foot-tall warrior had been born for battle, and Blue had gained the distinct impression the few times their paths had crossed that he resented being born the leader of the Second Realm, one that was peaceful and rarely went to war. He leaned over the map, planting large hands on the edge of the table, the muscles of his bare chest and shoulders bulging as they supported his weight. A hank of wild black hair fell down and he huffed and preened it back again. Blue was glad the male had chosen to keep his attention on the imminent threat and not his female. The bastard was too good-looking for a demon. The gods only knew how many females had fallen victim of him. Blue had seen him flash a smile at a female once during a gathering, and that female had fainted. Literally fucking fainted. King Tegan had been all too willing to administer first aid to the poor creature. She was probably now part of the harem he apparently kept in his black castle. To King Tegan's right stood a beautiful female with a fall of straight white hair that her milky skin almost matched. It blended into her white corseted dress, and the paleness of her attire, her skin and her hair, made her blue eyes look ethereal and stunningly bright. Those eyes drifted to rest on Blue, and cold swept through him in the second before he moved his gaze down to the map. He swore she chuckled right in his head. The Phantom Queen of the First Realm. He suppressed the shiver that tried to run through him. Phantoms were dangerous. Their beauty and grace enchanted males and lured them under their spell, making it easier for the female to turn them incorporeal in order to mate with them and condemning them to an eternity as a spirit. If they didn't feed on their soul, anyway. Somehow, King Valador, Melia's fallen demon mate, had given her flesh and substance, allowing them to live together in the First Realm. Queen Melia had assumed the role as king of the First Realm after the death of Valador, and was set to rule until their son Tarwin came of age. Blue lifted his curious gaze to the female beside Melia as the queen spoke to her. They were strikingly similar. It was only the feel of another's gaze on him that had him looking away from the pair of females. Off to his left, beyond Lauren, Rosalind the Witch stood beside her mate, all fairness and light in comparison to him, with her wavy golden hair spilling around her shoulders and almost glowing in the bright light coming in through the tall windows at her back. She smiled softly at Blue, one that made her blue eyes sparkle. Vale growled low in his throat and slung an arm around her slender shoulders, his fingers curling over to pull on the black material of her dress. Those pale, slender fingers transformed into claws as his armor completed itself. She sighed and looked up at her mate. Blue looked at him too. Not a single ounce of regret touched Vale's features, ones that were close to Lauren's now that his black hair had been trimmed and some of the darkness had left his violet eyes. Vale's pointed ears flared back against the sides of his head, and Blue expected him to bare his fangs on a hiss. He didn't. He looked at Terran instead. Blue hissed at Vale, flashing his emerging fangs, warning the male away from her. Vale frowned at her and then at him, all aggression gone as he raised an eyebrow and his violet eyes filled with curiosity, laced with something that surprised Blue. Happiness. There was no mistaking that glow in his eyes as the corners of his lips curled into a faint smile. Vale was happy for him. The world truly had gone mad. Blue was heading right there with the rest of it, because while he wasn't sure how Lauren had managed to convince the council to agree to Vale's presence in the kingdom, there was a part of him that hoped the elf male could do something in the impending battle that would help his cause. He wanted Vale to give the elders and the people of their kingdom a reason to trust him again. "Shall we begin?" Lauren's deep voice cut through the silence, and there was a murmur of agreement. "The dragon skirted the second kingdom, passing along the other side of this mountain range." King Tegan couldn't have sounded more irritated if he had tried, as he ran his left hand along the curving spine of mountains to the north of his kingdom, the front of his black leather trousers pressing against the edge of the three-dimensional map. "He remained firmly inside the border of the first realm." A faint purple-red glow lit his dark eyes, a corona around his pupils that warned the male's mood was already degenerating. King Tegan was hungry for a battle. Blue was surprised he hadn't risked crossing the border into the First Realm in order to engage Tenak. Still, the male would have his war soon enough. "He came through my land on this course, decimating all in his path." Thorn charted one that had many in the room falling silent, including Blue. Tenak had cut right through the heart of the Third Realm. "He has recruited an army along the way, men from my ranks, traders in the countryside, even some demons from the surrounding realms. We managed to evacuate some of the villages in his path, but others were not so lucky. We have lost many warriors and subjects already." Thorn sighed and preened his left horn, stroking his fingers along the dusky curve of it. Sable rested her right palm on his shoulder, and he looked down at her, pain visible in his crimson eyes. The Demon King had lost enough of his men and his people in a war with the Fifth Realm only a few lunar cycles ago. Losing so many more in such a short span of time was taking its toll on the large male. "We will make him pay for what he has done," Blue said, and Thorn raised his head, looked across at him, and nodded. Queen Melia drifted forwards, coming closer to the map, gliding away from her companion. "I have had word that the dragon's army has passed through our outlying lands, and has banked towards the center of my kingdom. Scouts have reported he is on a direct course with a point beyond the demon kingdoms and yours. It seems he is intending to recruit more, possibly from the other realms that lie that way." Her soft voice floated around the room, an eerie quality to it. She ghosted her hand over the map, the motion strangely light and slow. Blue suppressed another shudder. He had run afoul of a phantom once or twice in his lifetime, and the experience had been enough to have his blood freezing whenever he thought about what Melia was. She lifted her bright blue eyes to him, as if she knew his secret fear, sending another shiver through him. "Tenak's army is strong, with many dragons among its ranks. My men are engaged with them now. My advisor Isla came to warn me, and she has witnessed the battle, so I brought her with me as she has valuable information." Blue had a feeling that Isla was more than an advisor to Melia, more than another phantom made flesh somehow. If he had to guess, he would say she was a sibling. He nodded towards the only realm on the course she had pointed out, wondering why she had chosen to speak of it as if there were more in that direction. "Do you believe any of the Free Realm will be joining the battle on either side?" King Tegan said. Isla stiffened. Curious. Melia had avoided naming the Free Realm during her report, and now Isla had reacted to hearing those words from Tegan's lips. "No," Blue said, and watched the female closely. "We sent word, but none of the sirens, nymphs, incubi, or succubi, shifter species, or furies offered allegiance, and stated they would not side with a dragon either." Isla didn't react to any of those species. He canted his head as he watched her. She carefully lifted her right hand, tucked a braid that hung from her temple behind her ear, blending it into her long hair. The blue crystals around the end of it stood out against the white of her hair. The braid that hung from her left temple bore crystals at the end too, but these were red. Her pale hand was shaking when she lowered it again, flexed her fingers, and then tucked her hands behind her back. Unlike Melia, Isla wore colorful clothing, tight deep blue leather trousers and a matching corset, and knee-high boots that were accented in vivid cerulean where the leather had rubbed. Blue almost smiled when he remembered there was another species who called the free realm home. "Although we did not come to an agreement with the vampires," he said, and she tensed. A vampire, then. She feared a vampire. "I am sure the Preux Chevaliers would join us if we turned off the portal and stopped sunlight from entering our realm." Isla paled, turning as white as her hair. Lauren's steady gaze landed on him, and Blue glanced at him, fielded a confused look from his prince, but refused to stop when he felt so close to finding out why the female was afraid of a vampire from the free realm, from the Preux Chevaliers no less. His eyes widened the tiniest amount before he schooled his features, hiding his surprise from the room. Lord Vandergarde, leader of the Preux Chevaliers, an army of vampires who acted as mercenaries in hell, had a deep distrust of females and despised liars. Was it possible? He couldn't resist finding out. Lord Vandergarde even requested we do so as he desired to join the battle. Blue kept his eyes locked on Isla as the air of confusion around Lauren grew, and a few others in the room joined him in staring at Blue. The female glanced at Melia, and Melia drifted closer to her, her ice-cold eyes coming to rest on Blue, chilling his blood and making his senses warn him of danger. He was angering the First King with his questioning, but he couldn't stop now. "Should we put it to a vote?" "We do not condone vampires near us," the First King said, her voice as calm and smooth as still water, but holding darkness beneath the placid surface, a threat that he knew he would be wise to heed. He was too fascinated by Isla, though. She looked ready to bolt. What had happened between her and Lord Vandergarde? The room whirled upwards and he stumbled backwards, confused for a heartbeat before he noticed Lauren's hand on his left arm, dragging him away from the table. Lauren shoved him into a corner and Blue looked at him. His prince did not look impressed. "Must I remind you that vampires were on the side of the demons from the Devil's Domain, in the battle a century ago that claimed King Valador's life?" Lauren snapped in the elf tongue, and the amusement Blue had been feeling drained from him. He had forgotten that. "I am sorry. I will apologize immediately," Blue said. Lauren shook his head. "It will not be necessary. But why did you lie about the vampires?" Blue glanced beyond his prince to the two phantom females. "I have a feeling that the one called Isla is or was somehow involved with Lord Vandergarde." Lauren's right eyebrow shot up, and he surprised Blue by looking back over his shoulder at the female in question. It wasn't like his prince to behave in such a manner. He had expected Lauren to resist the desire to look at her, and take the more respectful approach of concealing his curiosity by treating her in the same manner as he did everyone else in the room. "You believe she is the reason?" Lauren hissed in a low voice, revealing that his intrigue ran as deep as Blue's own, and that he wasn't the only one who had noticed Lord Vandergarde's behavior during the time they had worked together on the side of the Third Realm. Blue nodded. "I believe she is the reason the vampire doesn't trust females." "Fascinating." Lauren looked back at her again, tensed. Blue looked past him and found everyone watching them. His prince released him, cleared his throat, and walked back to the table as if nothing had happened, and they hadn't been hiding in a corner, acting in an almost conspiratorial manner. "Let us discuss our plan and see what we can come up with. Taryn will lead us by sharing information on a vision she witnessed." Blue didn't like the sound of that. The vision had shaken her. He moved back to her side, standing close to her so she would feel him there, would know that he was there for her if she needed him. He listened to her as she relayed what she had seen in her vision, and fielded a few questions from the Demon Kings, and then tried to focus on everyone else in the room as they began to discuss ideas about what they should do. Impossible. Being so close to Taryn had all of his focus drifting back to her the second he tried to pull it away. He took in everything that was being bandied about in the room, but couldn't find his voice to speak out against any of it. He felt Lauren glance at him several times, and then Sable joined in too, but nothing he did could convince him to take his eyes off his beautiful mate as she stood tall beside him, trying to make her voice heard in the din of chatter. It was only when she mentioned the garrison where he had taken her when he had teleported them away from Tenak's castle that he felt a stirring need to agree with her. That need only grew when the Demon Kings and Lauren talked over her, ignoring what she had offered and making his little female withdraw into herself. Blue frowned at everyone present. "Taryn is right, and we should move away from the castle." Lauren arched an eyebrow at him and held his hand up. The room fell silent. "The stronghold is ideal. It is a defensive position close to the Free Realm, bordering the first realm of the demons, and we have supplies in place there." Blue leaned over and planted his right palm against the edge of the map and pointed to the spot where the garrison was with his left hand, a small area that was close to not only the first realm but the free one too. "It is away from any villages on both the elf side and the demon side." Everyone murmured in agreement, and he felt Taryn move closer to him, sensed her warmth flow through their link. She was pleased he had made her voice heard in the room. He was glad she had been brave enough to mention it, because it really was ideal. Her vision had been of the castle in ruins and the battle taking place there. By moving the battle away from the castle, they might stand a chance of changing the future she had witnessed. He rubbed the pad of his left thumb across his lower lip and frowned at the map. "We will need to infiltrate the enemy ranks to steal the sword back. It is pivotal. Whoever possesses it will win. There is no doubt about that." Rosalind rocked on her heels, almost bouncing on the spot, causing her drab black traditional witch's dress to sway around her legs. And when he looked at her, she was grinning, starlight sparkling in her blue eyes. "I have a cunning plan." Everyone stared at her in silence, stony faces waiting for her to explain it. Apparently, this was the wrong reaction. She huffed, folded her arms across her chest, and muttered, "You all need to watch more classic British telly." Everyone continued to stare at her. "Perhaps you should explain your plan, little Wild Rose." Vale lowered his head and murmured the words into her ear, and her cheeks darkened. The starlight in her eyes exploded into fire, and she leaned towards him. Vale's gaze darkened the moment she did, his breathing deepening and eyes dropping to her throat. Blue was sorely tempted to tell them to get a room, but he liked his head where it was, attached to his body. Lauren cleared his throat. Vale stilled. Rosalind's blush deepened, and she blinked rapidly. I was going to address the dragon in the room, and say that I will mask Taryn by changing the color of her scales," Rosalind said, a wobble of uncertainty in her voice now. She glanced at her mate, dragged her eyes away, glanced at him again. With each one, her eyes grew darker, pupils expanding to swallow the blue of her irises. She cleared her throat again, but couldn't clear the rosiness of desire from her cheeks as easily. "It's a simple spell, really, and it should allow her to enter the enemy's camp and get close enough to steal the sword." "No." Blue left no room for argument in his rejection, but it didn't stop several people, including Taryn, from voicing one. He crossed his arms over his chest, scowled at everyone, and made damn sure they realized that he wasn't going to budge on this. "Taryn is not going in there alone. She needs backup." "Perhaps we could convince Loki to help," Lauren said. "We do not have time," Blue countered. "Loki is great as a backup plan, but Tenak knows him. Rosalind would have to change the color of his scales too." Rosalind shook her head. "I won't have enough strength to cast 2 spells like that, if I'm also expected to shield the garrison and the land surrounding it as I did for Thorn in the battle in the Third Realm." There was more to her refusal than a drain on her energy, too. It was there in her eyes as she tossed a wary look at her mate. She was nervous about using so much magic around Vale, afraid it would send him off the deep end and drive him back into the madness that seemed to have abated in their time together. Abated but not disappeared. Vale's eyes were already growing black, and they were only talking about magic. Rosalind turned to Vale and Blue looked away, giving them some privacy as she sought to soothe her mate. The room grew noisy as a debate broke out about how they could provide Taryn with backup if they couldn't use another dragon. Blue held his hand up and came right out with it. "I will shift into a dragon." Everyone stared at him, stunned expressions on all their faces. Lauren was the first to find his voice. "How?" Blue looked to his left, at his prince. I will drink Taryn's blood. He could almost feel the heat of her blush where she stood to his right, and gods, he wanted to look at her. His heart pounded, blood thundering with a need to shift his eyes down to her and take in her beauty as her cheeks blazed crimson. There was hunger in her, and it ran through him too, ignited by remembering the last time he had bitten her, a memory that flooded his mind with the wicked thoughts he had heard in hers because of the siren's blood in his veins. Lauren's violet gaze moved to her. Blue growled low in his throat, a feral snarl that had a few in the room gasping. He was halfway to calling his armor and jamming his clawed thumbs into Lauren's eyes so his prince couldn't look at his fated female, when Lauren slid him a black look, but one edged with knowing and a sprinkling of amusement. He could almost hear Lauren's thoughts, and his prince was right. He was acting exactly as Lauren had behaved around Olivia, and Kiter around Iolanthe, and even Thorn around Sable. He had become territorial, extremely possessive and protective, and downright obsessed with his female, and he wasn't going to apologize for it. Fuck them. He didn't take his eyes off Lauren, but mentally he looked at everyone in the room and said, fuck you all. He was a male in the middle of a mating, and he didn't give a damn what they thought. The only thing that mattered was Taryn and securing her as his female. His forever. I think we are done here for today. Relay the plan to your people, and we will meet again tomorrow to go over the final details. Lauren didn't take his eyes off Blue either, held his gaze even as everyone filed out of the room, leaving them alone in it. When the doors closed, his prince's lips tugged into a wicked smile. Feeling a little touchy today, are we not? A little territorial, perhaps. Blue looked away from him and groaned when he saw that Taryn hadn't left the room. This really wasn't a conversation he wanted happening in front of her. It wasn't a conversation he wanted happening at all. You growled at me, Blue, and looked ready to raise a hand to me again. Lauren pressed onwards, mischievous bastard, clearly amused by his plight. Did I hear and see that wrongly? Blue refused to answer. Maybe if he was silent, Lauren would drop it. Nope. Lauren grinned. I believe someone is acting like a prick. Is that not what you called it when I was territorial about Olivia? I am not, Blue snapped. It is nothing. Your imagination is running wild, my prince. Lauren chuckled. Is that so? Then if I do this... He turned his smile on Taryn. Blue was on him in an instant, both hands wrapped around his throat as he snarled at him and pushed him down onto the stone flags. He sat astride the male's chest, shoving his arms down with his knees. He tried to pull himself away, but he couldn't. His body had other plans, his primal instincts at the helm. Nothing he did made a difference. He kept tightening his hold on Lauren's throat, choking him. Lauren managed to wrestle his arms free and his hands snagged Blue's wrists. He struggled, trying to prise Blue's hands off him. His prince's lips moved, but Blue couldn't hear anything over the maddening rush of blood through his ears and the dark whispers to kill the male for daring to flirt with his female. Blue! He snarled and ignored that softer feminine voice as it curled around him. He had to kill the male. No, he had to stop. He didn't want to hurt Lauren. Lauren had to die. Blue! The female voice said again, and this time it caught and held him, and the warmth of his name on her lips broke through the darkness like a shaft of light, driving it back. He stared at his hands where they held Lauren's throat. His eyes widened, and he released him and staggered onto his feet. Taryn touched his shoulder. He jerked away from her and paced across the room, putting himself as far as he could get from Lauren. Gods, he had tried to kill him, a male he loved deeply. He hadn't wanted to hurt him, but he hadn't been able to stop himself. The hunger to hurt him still lingered, and he feared it would rise up again to overwhelm him. He shoved his fingers through his unruly blue-black hair, clawed his scalp, and drew blood. Lauren picked himself up and rubbed his throat. I deserved that. He didn't. Blue wrestled with himself and managed to find his voice. I'm sorry. How long have you known? Lauren said. That question opened a floodgate inside him, and Blue let it all spill out, telling his prince everything, beginning at the moment he had first set eyes on Taryn. "The bond is triggered?" Lauren asked with a concerned glance at Taryn, his eyes only landing on her for a split second before they wisely moved back to Blue. He still wasn't totally in control of himself, and even that brief glance at Taryn was enough to have him wanting Lauren's blood again. He breathed deep and nodded to answer him. Lauren looked concerned. "Incomplete?" Blue nodded again. He knew it was dangerous to leave it in such a state, especially when he was going to be around so many males during the upcoming battle. Unmated males. Just the thought of that was enough to have his blood burning again, catching fire. He itched with a need to track down all of the unmated males and kill them before they could look at his mate and try to steal her from him. She was precious. His treasure. Gods, he was thinking like a damned dragon. He glanced across at Taryn. The way she was looking at him, the possessive heat in her gaze, told him that was her thoughts, her feelings, flowing through him too and bolstering his own ones, making them stronger. She viewed him as precious, her treasure. That pleased him way too damn much. "Do not leave it incomplete, Blue," Lauren said in the elf tongue, concealing their conversation from Taryn. Blue sighed and looked back at his prince, all of the fears he had been suppressing rising to the fore as his fight left him. "It isn't that simple. Our history, my history." He wasn't a good mate. He wasn't a good male. He hadn't done anything right by Taryn. He had hurt her, hunted her. Lauren exhaled softly, his expression shifting, revealing tenderness and warmth that was a strange comfort to him, leaving him feeling as if he wasn't alone and Lauren was in his corner, a backup he sorely needed. "I have never seen you like this," Lauren said in their tongue. "I know it is not a product of the bond, Blue. If you love Taryn, then you must fight for her." Lauren was right. He loved Taryn. What he felt for her had brought with it a realization that profoundly affected him, strengthening his feelings for her. He had never really known love before now. What he felt for Taryn was powerful. It controlled him, ruled his actions and his heart, and he could think of only her. What he had felt for Sable was nothing but a shadow of what he felt for Taryn, easily pushed out of existence by the strength of the light of Taryn's love for him and his love for her. It was endless, infinite, unconditional, a love that he knew would last forever, even if there was no bond and they weren't mates. He would love this female with every shred of his heart, drop of his blood, and piece of his soul, whether she was his fated one or not. He had never felt for anyone the way he felt about Taryn. She was his everything. She was all he needed. She completed him as no other could. The other half of his soul. But it was frightening after everything he had been through, all the changes that had happened too quickly and had shaken his world. He wasn't sure he was strong enough to handle her rejecting him. It would destroy him. But he had been born to fight, not run from a battle. And he would fight for her. Chapter 33. Gods, her mate was beautiful. Even more so now. He stole her breath, robbing her awareness of the world with it, leaving her feeling dazed and in awe as she gazed upon him. Her incredible male. Her tiny dragon. Not so tiny anymore. She flinched when he crashed into the side of the green hill, scuffing the grass and leaving a long muddy track in his wake as he slowly slid to a halt. Beautiful, but not entirely graceful. Blue pushed himself up, huge talons curling into the soft ground that gave beneath his weight, and shook his head, his 6 long black horns becoming a blur in the bright light. He snorted, his jowls peeled back off twin rows of razor-sharp white teeth, and then his huge violet eyes dropped to her where she stood a short distance away, sharpening as they focused and challenged her. She didn't dare let the laugh that had been bubbling up her throat slip free. She had made the mistake of laughing at him the first time he crash-landed a few hours ago, and that had earned her more than just a growl or a scowl in her direction. He had come running at her, heavy footfalls shaking the ground, tipping her off balance. It had ended with her planted on her backside and her mate towering over her, his beaked snout close to her face. Her heart had almost pounded right out of her chest. Not wholly because of fear, though. Blue's display of dominance, strength, and aggression had triggered her dragon instincts, leaving her a quivering mess, aching for her mate to shift back and kiss the breath from her. She wasn't sure he knew what he had done to her in that moment, how hot he had made her, igniting a wildfire in her veins. Gods! Just thinking about it had heat stirring in her blood again, her pulse accelerating and body coming alive, hungry for his touch. Blue's huge violet eyes narrowed and he inhaled deeply, stilled, and then his eyes widened, his elliptical pupils dilating, and the black spines down his neck and back rippled. He was aware of her need. He turned towards her and the light reflected off his black scales, sending a blue shimmer across them. She had never seen any dragon like him. It was rare for one of her kind to have 6 horns, 2 sprouting from the ridges above his eyes, 2 from the crown of his head, and a further 2 from the back behind his ears. He was larger than most male dragons, too, packed with sinewy muscle and a wingspan that dwarfed her own. He lowered his enormous head, his long neck stretching as he stalked closer to her, the underside of his jaw held barely a few feet from the grass. His muscular shoulders worked with each slow step, his wings shifting restlessly and his long tail swishing side to side. She raised her hand when he was close enough for her to touch him and rested her palm on his hard snout between his nostrils. He exhaled again and then sniffed and canted his head. "Shall I show you how it is done?" she said, voice a low murmur, as she tried to wrestle her desire back under control and focus on their lesson. It was hard when her body was still buzzing from the feel of his fangs in her flesh. He had bitten her wrist this time, insisting that he take blood from that spot, and it still throbbed madly, a constant reminder of where he had sunk his fangs into her. She had wanted him to bite her neck again, but she hadn't had the heart to push him, not when he had seemed on edge, his feelings relaying his nerves to her, and also the lingering trace of guilt. That guilt was there whenever he gazed at her neck, and she wished she could find a way to help him move past what he had done to her. She had forgiven him, but he hadn't forgiven himself. "Controlling the shift is the easy part," she continued, and rubbed between his nostrils, smiling as his eyes fluttered closed. Her mate liked that. "Learning to fly is something else, and you will have to learn to fight on the wing, too." She had the feeling it wasn't going to be easy for him. It had taken him a few attempts to shift into a dragon, and he had spent the past few hours lumbering around the valley, barely making it a few meters off the ground before he hit it again. Normally hard. The valley was filled with the evidence of his failures, long dark scars that crisscrossed the perfect green grass, making it look as if a battle had taken place, not a simple flying lesson. Blue snarled and reared back, the suddenness of it startling her and causing her to stagger backwards, placing some distance between them. He threw his head to one side and then the other, a constant growl curling from between his clenched fangs. She gasped and held her hands up to him as immense pain ran through her, pain that came from him. "Blue!" She reached for him, but he stumbled away from her. His hind left leg gave out and he slammed onto his side, his head smacking hard off the hillside. Taryn ran down the gentle slope to him and skidded to a halt as she realized what was happening. He was shifting back, and by the looks of things, it wasn't a controlled transformation. Something was wrong. "Blue!" she hollered and raced over to him, reaching him just as his body began to shrink, bones shifting beneath his flesh as it lost all of its scales, turning creamy and smooth. Another pained growl left his lips, and his wild violet eye looked down at her, the agony she could feel flowing through him shining in it. She couldn't breathe as she kneeled beside his head and petted him, stroking along the line of his muzzle, trying to comfort him and take some of his pain away. His eye closed and he snarled, his jowl peeling back off his fangs, shifting beneath her hand. His body shrank, wings disappearing into it, and his head began to transform. The change was quick from that point, and in little more than a blink of her eyes, he was an elf again. A very naked elf. He lay with his head in her lap, curled up on his side and shivering, his pale skin spotted with sweat as he breathed hard. Taryn ran her fingers through his blue-black hair, smoothing the damp strands back from his forehead and his pointed ear. He groaned when she accidentally brushed the tip of it, and his eyes fluttered open. Dark-sounding words in his own tongue left his lips as he looked up at her, violet eyes still swimming with the pain echoing through him. He was cursing. She had noticed he tended to do that in the elf tongue rather than one she could understand, as if she might be offended if she heard him swearing or would think less of him. "What happened?" she whispered, wanting to know because she didn't understand, and she needed to if she was going to find a way to stop it from happening again. He closed his eyes, slumped against her, and blew out his breath. "I ran out." She averted her gaze when he rolled onto his back, exposing himself for a split second before his armor appeared, black scales rippling over his bare skin, in the same way they had when he had transformed into a dragon. "How did you run out? It has only been a few hours." She frowned down at his face, keeping her gaze locked on his closed eyes. They opened and met hers. "I did not take enough." "Oh." Because he had felt guilty about biting her and taking her blood. Her frown intensified. "That was stupid of you." He frowned right back at her. She didn't give him a chance to speak. "I know you think you are being noble by only taking a small amount of blood from me, and that you feel guilty still even though I have forgiven you. But what in the gods' names did you think you were doing?" She almost growled that question at him as her mind filled with all the possibilities, most of them ending with a horrible outcome. One haunted her most of all, though, chilled her blood and left her cold and empty, and it was one she knew would make him see sense. "What if this had happened when you had been flying, Blue?" "I could have teleported." She did growl now. "You are weak from the uncontrolled shift. Do you think you can teleport?" He looked away from her, and it was all the answer she needed. "I will not have you kill yourself because you think you are doing me some sort of kindness, sparing me from something. If you will not take enough blood to make your abilities as a dragon last, then I will not give you any at all." She went to stand, but his hand shot up over his head and locked tight around her bare upper arms. She looked down at him, right into his eyes, and waited for him to speak. When he didn't, she gave him an ultimatum. "You either take the blood I am offering to you, or I go alone into my brother's camp to steal the sword." He flashed long white daggers at her, his violet eyes brightening in response to her threat. It was more of a promise. "Fine," he ground out, eyes darkening by degrees, and dragged her right arm forwards toward his face. "But remember you asked for this by leaving me no other choice." She gasped as he twisted her arm towards him and sank his fangs into the tender skin on the underside of her forearm. The brief sting of pain was followed by a rolling wave of bliss, warmth that heated her right down to her bones, stirring fire in her veins. Her eyes slipped shut and she sank into the flames, let them flutter around her. Dragon fire. He made it burn in her blood, rousing her deepest instincts, the ones that shoved at her control. A growl curled from her lips as those instincts seized hold of her, forcing her eyes open, making her look at the male drinking from her. Her fated one. The hunger to mate with him was strong, near impossible to deny, but she fought it anyway, aware that if she gave in to it, she might end up with her heart broken. Blue's eyes locked with hers, held them firm, cast a spell on her that had her quivering all over, aching and hot with need. She had to mate. The urge crawled over her skin, making it itch and feel too hot. She needed to satisfy this hunger, needed to scratch that itch he had started when he had come at her, all brute force and wicked power. She shuddered as he pulled on her blood, a deeper one that had it all rushing towards him. And God, she wanted him to take more of her into him. She wanted to be bound to him. She wanted to possess him. He was hers. He would be no one else's. Never. She bared her sharpening teeth and snarled through them, a deep rumbling growl born of her possessive thoughts. The urge to fight welled up, intoxicating, seeping into her mind and her heart to take control of it. She had to fight whoever might take her mate from her. A female flickered into her mind, the one with the black hair and golden eyes. She had seen the way that female had gazed at Blue with affection in those beautiful eyes in the war room. Taryn snarled again. She would claw the female's eyes out, ensuring she could never gaze on her mate again. Blue was hers, no one else's. She looked over her left shoulder towards the towering pale castle where the female waited, probably for Blue. A roar left her lips and she shoved onto her feet, tearing her wrist away from Blue's fangs. She would slay the female and then Blue would be hers. He would love her, forever. A strong hand clamped down on her right arm just above her elbow and spun her to face the owner. She went to snarl, and it ended in a gasp as his mouth descended on hers, fierce and hot, stoking the fire in her blood to 1,000 degrees. She moaned and clutched his muscular shoulders, pressed closer to him and lost herself in the kiss, forgetting her desire to kill, as it was replaced with a desire to drown in this male and his hunger for her. His lips broke away from hers, their foreheads pressed together, but his hands still held her, gripping her with the same intensity as she clung to him. "Better?" he murmured, his husky deep voice making her insides quiver and flip, and she melted against him, unsure how to answer his question because she didn't understand it. Something had been wrong? He pulled back and his black eyebrows drew down, his violet eyes searching hers. A sigh left those lips she desperately wanted on hers again, and she trembled when he brushed the knuckles of his left hand across her cheek. "Who did you want to kill?" he whispered, and she recalled that she had desired to do such a thing. She slowly looked back at the castle, felt ridiculous now as she thought about it, but at the time the need had been fierce, gripping her tightly, and it had felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. "The black-haired female," she said in a low voice, little more than a murmur as fear took hold of her, her heart whispering that her male was going to be upset with her and that he was going to defend the female, maybe even confess his desire for the mortal. Taryn tried to pull away, a sudden need to distance herself gripping her, but Blue held her too tightly, not allowing her to escape. He sighed, husked, "She is nothing to me, Taryn. It is just the bond messing with you. I view all males as a threat, and you view all females." That wasn't true. She didn't view the phantom females as a threat. She only viewed the mortal female she knew to be a rival for his affection as one. "She has feelings for you." She lifted her eyes to meet his, put force behind those words that she hoped made it clear that he couldn't fool her into thinking otherwise. She knew what she had seen, and she trusted her dragon instincts, and they were the one labeling the mortal as a threat, not the bond. "As a friend." There was something in the way he said that, and the sorrow that flitted across his feelings that rang alarm bells in her mind, and had her on the warpath again. "But you desired something more?" She broke free of his grip and backed away from him, a dull ache starting up in her chest, one that grew sharper with each beat of her heart. "Taryn." Blue reached for her, but she shook her head. She wouldn't go back to him, not until she knew the truth. He sighed and lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging with it. "I thought I had stronger feelings for her, but I was mistaken. You made me see that." Her eyes widened. "Me?" He nodded. "I was lonely, and it made me believe I felt something for Sable. But seeing you again made me realize that I felt nothing for her beyond friendship. I wanted someone to love me, and someone to love, and I settled on the first female I saw who I found attractive." Taryn snarled at that. Blue held his hand up. "Let me finish before you go on a rampage." She had half a mind to refuse, but the tender edge to his violet eyes and the emotions that flowed through their link had her remaining where she was, because she had the feeling that this was a monumental moment for him, that her male rarely spoke of his feelings, and this was difficult for him, and important, for both of them. "Sable could never have given me what I wanted, because there is only one female in all the realms who could give me that. And that is you, Taryn." He shook his head when she opened her mouth to speak. "No, not because of fate or a bond, but because of the way you look at me, the way you make me feel when I'm around you. You give me a purpose, and that purpose is to protect you, to always make you happy, to take care of you, because it is you I love." Taryn stared at him, reeling, mind racing and thoughts scrambling. His look turned uncomfortable, and he scrubbed a hand around the back of his neck, and a ripple of hurt went through him. It drove her into action. Before he could turn away or withdraw or teleport or something equally as annoying, she hurled herself against him, wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. He moaned, slipped his arms around her waist, and held her against him so hard that she couldn't breathe. But she didn't care as she sank into the kiss and let his words run around her mind, using them to chase away the ones that had started to haunt her. Teaching Blue how to shift into a dragon had brought a moment of brightness into a dark time, but it had also made something else hit home. Her brother would die if their plan succeeded. Blue stopped kissing her and pulled back. "What is wrong?" She shook her head and kissed him again, trying to make him and herself forget about it. He had just told her that he loved her, and she wanted to say the same to him. But thoughts of her brother stole her voice and darkened what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. Blue refused her, and his hands caught her shoulders, pushing her away. "Tell me, Taryn," he whispered, so imploring and tender that tears welled up in her eyes. He frowned at them, lifted his left hand and swept the pad of his thumb beneath her right eye and then her left one, dashing them away. "Why are you sad?" That question made her truly believe everything he had told her, because the look on his handsome face said he needed to know so he could make her happy again. She wasn't sure that was possible. "The battle. I might lose a part of myself. Will lose a part of myself." She looked away from him and sighed as the thoughts she had been trying to shut out crowded her mind. "I can imagine how that feels," he murmured, and she believed that too. This time she could feel it in him, a pang that was familiar to her now that she faced losing her brother. He sighed. "I have come close to losing my sister a few times, and I feel I would be empty without her in my life." Empty. That hit her hard, and tears burned her eyes and stung her nose. She turned away before he could see them this time, and stared at the beautiful lands that surrounded her, green and lush, like something out of a fairy tale. But they seemed to have lost all color and warmth as she looked at them now, feeling cold to the bone. Another sigh escaped Blue. "I can feel you, remember? There is no use trying to hide things from me. Not when I feel your pain as if it is my own." He moved around her and brushed his left knuckles across her cheek, his tender gaze stealing her breath and warming her cold heart. He opened his hand and cupped her cheek, trailed his fingers along her jaw and tipped her head up. She ached for him to say something, anything that might stop her from thinking about how she was standing on the brink of losing a connection that had filled her from the moment she was born. She had never been alone. Never. She feared it. He seemed to read that in her mind, because he smiled softly, his violet gaze filled with warmth, but also a ribbon of fear, and whispered the most beautiful words she had ever heard. "You are not alone, Taryn. I am yours. If you want me." Gods, did she. She wanted him with all of her heart. "I am tired of fighting this. Are you not tired too? We were made for each other. I honestly feel that. Two halves of one soul. Two hearts that were always meant to be together. That were created to complete each other." He swept his thumb up her cheek, and she couldn't deny it, or the fire that burned through her in response to his heated but tender look. She stood on the brink of losing a connection to someone she had loved, but she was also on the brink of forging a new one with someone she loved. Someone she loved with all of her heart. A male who did complete her, who made her feel safe and warm, cherished and protected, but strong too. His love gave her strength and courage, hope and conviction, and she knew that if she accepted the heart he was offering to her and the future he wanted for them, that she would always feel this way, filled with light when she had lived through so much darkness. She didn't need to fly. She didn't need the blue skies of the mortal realm. She didn't need anything that had once been everything to her. She only needed blue. He was her infinite sky. He made her soar while her feet never left the ground, made her warm as if sunshine bathed her skin, and made her feel whole. He was her home, her everything, now and forever. "Say something," he whispered, a slight tremble in his deep voice that gave away his nerves. Taryn tiptoed, framed his face with her hands to keep his beautiful eyes locked on hers, and let the words spill from her heart, no longer afraid of voicing them. "I love you." Chapter 34. Blue couldn't believe what he was hearing as Taryn's lips moved, her sweet voice rising above the rushing in his ears, sinking her words deep into his heart. She loved him. His breath left him in a whoosh, ears rang and heart thundered as he struggled to take that in and make himself believe it. His eyes darted between hers, her palms warm on his face, the contact keeping the connection between them wide open so he could feel everything that she was: fear, hope, nervousness, love. She loved him. Gods. Holy fuck. Hell. He blinked hard, fought to convince himself to do something, to form some sort of response. Lauren's words rattled around his head, telling him to complete their bond before the battle began, and everything primal in him responded to that with a ferocious need to finally claim the beautiful female who stood before him. He growled low in his throat, the raw sound spilling from between his fangs as they emerged, punched long from his gums at the thought of finally having his own mate, his Kiara. Taryn's violet-to-white eyes lit up, hunger burning in them that stoked the fire in his veins and made it flare hotter, until it consumed him and all he could think about was how quickly he could get her to his apartment. The shift was quick to come, startling him and Taryn both. She gasped and stumbled back as she grew smaller in his vision, the green lands of the elf kingdom falling away as he grew in size, his bones lengthening and distorting as his body transformed into that of a dragon. Her surprise passed, the hunger in her gaze growing as she tipped her head back and looked up at him with eyes that backed up the sudden spike in her desire. She liked what she saw. His female approved of his dragon form. He threw his head back and roared, the sound echoing across the lands, tearing from his throat in a ground-trembling cry of triumph that he couldn't contain. His female loved him. Taryn would be his forever. An answering growl left her lips, and he dropped his head and looked down at her, caught the fire that blazed in her eyes as her pupils dilated, gobbling up the white so her irises looked more violet, like his beautiful female. He snarled and snatched her up into his paw and kicked off, huge black leathery wings pounding the air as he lifted into it. Taryn's hot little hands clutched his thumb and index claw, and he tucked her closer to his chest. His focus fixed on the castle ahead of him, and he beat his wings harder, desperate to reach it and claim his female. The ground came up at him fast, and he grunted as his back paws struck it hard, and he stumbled across the grass, lumbering as he struggled to remain upright and keep from collapsing onto Taryn. "You are trying too hard." Her voice seemed so quiet when he was in this form, even when she was shouting. He staggered to a halt and prepared for another attempt, and growled as Taryn pushed free of his paw and dropped to the grass. He swiped at her, but she evaded him, dancing and spinning out of his reach as he tried to reclaim her. What the hell was she doing? He needed to get her to the castle now, damn it, right this instant. He didn't have time for any delay. It was killing him. He needed to claim her. He reached for her again and reared back when she shifted, becoming a beautiful, slender violet and white dragon. She stood a head shorter than him, her 4 white horns a contrast against her deep violet scales and bright purple eyes. Her vertical pupils narrowed into thin slits, and his instincts as a dragon demanded he satisfy his mate. She desired him. His jowls peeled back off his fangs as he drew her scent over them, caught the hunger and arousal in it. He stalked towards her, heavy footfalls shaking the ground, driven by a deep need to mate with her. She blinked, turned away from him, and kicked off before he reached her, taking to the air. Blue growled and beat his wings, lifting into the air after her. The ground dropped away as she flew higher, and he wobbled as the wind hit him, and then his stomach fell as the valley suddenly grew tiny. He spread his wings, smoothing out his ascent as the thermal carried him higher, faster, until he was closing in on Taryn where she soared gracefully above him. She looked down, canted her head, and he swore she was smiling at him. He didn't want to look down at how high he was now, so he fixed his gaze on her and beat his wings. The rush of fear he had felt on suddenly shooting into the air flowing out of him, as his hunger for her swept in to replace it. When he neared her barbed tail, she let out a cry and dropped, swooping right. He growled and banked, plummeting after her. She beat her wings and circled around, and he mirrored her, giving a single hard beat of his to accelerate into the turn. Cold wind rushed across his face and streamed over his back, but it did nothing to cool his blood as he pursued her. Whenever he had almost caught up with her, she twisted or turned, evading him. Every time she gained distance, his blood burned hotter, heart pounded harder. He lost himself in the chase, gave himself over to his instincts, and embraced them. Flying had seemed impossible and strange before, but as he pursued her through the cool air, mirroring her every move and slowly closing in on her, it felt as natural as breathing. He was rarely beating his wings when he had been hammering them before, constantly using them with little effect, relying on them to keep him airborne. Now he relied on the thermals and currents, using his wings more as a tool to steer his course, gliding through the air on them and only beating them in order to accelerate. It was incredible. Taryn swooped again, rolling in the air as she banked left and downwards, her wings pinned against her back. He furled his and dropped with her, twisting through the sky, and a cry left his lips, startling him, born of the thrill that rushed through him. Taryn unleashed a cry of her own, one that he understood, shocking him again. She was enjoying this too, but her excitement was born of the chase. She liked him hunting her, pursuing her through the sky and slowly gaining ground on her. She spread her violet and white wings and shot straight past him. His gaze tracked her, head tipping up as he watched her soar into the air until she was a speck. He stretched his wings wide and his stomach somersaulted as he caught the same thermal and rocketed up into the cooler air. His wing knocked hers as he passed her, and she playfully rolled onto her back, their eyes meeting for a heartbeat before she twisted back around the right way and dropped again. Her tail whipped against the air, streaming behind her as she plummeted towards the castle. Blue growled and dove after her, his blood rushing and heating as he slowly gained on her. Wind battered his face, chilling his scales, but he didn't feel the pain of it biting into him as he chased her. He felt only heat and hunger, fire that blazed so hot he felt as if he could breathe it if he opened his jaw and roared. Taryn unfurled her wings a few 100 feet above the castle. He kept his pinned back, determined to catch his mate. She banked right and he twisted that way, adjusting his course. She lazily flew towards the rear of the castle, towards his balcony. Thoughts of claiming her flooded his mind, sending the temperature of his blood soaring, making his heart drum in his ears as he closed in on her. She turned and looked up at him. Just as he spread his wings and collided with her back, he grabbed her hips with his rear paws and her shoulders with his front ones and drove her down. She unleashed a high-pitched cry, but it wasn't one of pain. It was one of joy. She loved that he had caught her. They plummeted towards the courtyard and the elves scattered, some yelling obscenities at him as he sent his prize crashing to the ground. Her paws hit the stone flags, cracking a few of them, and he landed on top of her, beating his wings so he didn't crush her with his weight. Instinct drove him firmly at the helm, and he seized the back of her neck with his fangs, pinned her beneath him. She settled, tucking her wings back, going still. When he growled against her neck, she answered, her call stoking the flames in his blood when he understood it. She was submitting to him. Gods. He staggered off her, and her gaze was shy as she pushed up, but fire still blazed in it, desire that he could feel through their link. She beat her wings and landed on the shared balcony outside their rooms. He gave a single hard beat and leaped up to join her. By the time he landed, she had already transformed back, and his mouth watered as she stole his breath again, his mind spinning as he watched her walking into her apartment. Naked. She disappeared from view, and he growled and willed the shift, eager to follow her, hungry to gaze upon her delicious curves, hungry for her. He didn't feel the shift when she poked her head back around the tall double doors, her violet to white hair falling away from the left side of her throat, exposing the marks he had placed on her. He couldn't feel anything but the fierce heat that burned in him, made him mad with need. He needed her. The moment he was back in his elf form, he strode towards her, uncaring that he was naked on the balcony and there was a chance someone might see. The only person he gave a damn about was seeing it, and that was all that mattered to him. The fierce edge to her striking eyes as they raked down his body, heating every inch of him, the one that said she wanted to eat him whole, turned his blood to wildfire. She disappeared into her apartment, and he followed her, a slave to his deepest primal instincts, the ones that thundered in his veins and told him to claim her. She would be his. He rounded the corner, the sheer light curtains brushing across his bare skin as he pushed through them. They shifted to reveal her room. It blurred as a hand closed around his throat, and his breath left him in a painful rush, when his back slammed into the wardrobe. Before he could gather his wits, her lips closed over his, crushing them with a fierce kiss that set his blood on fire. He growled, grabbed her bare hips, and dragged her against him as he deepened the kiss, thrusting his tongue past the barrier of her lips. Sharp teeth scraped against his tongue, and he moaned in time with her as the taste of his own blood flooded his mouth. Taryn's hand on his throat slid to his shoulder, and her claws bit into his muscles as she writhed against him, sending tiny bolts of hot pain skittering through his body. His grip on her waist tightened. She moaned deeper, clawed harder, rubbed more fiercely against him. Her heart thundered in his ears and his chest, driving his on until the beat was so quick it was dizzying and stripped him down to his basest instincts, the ones that screamed at him to claim this female. He obeyed them, running his hands up her sides to her ribs, aiming for her breasts, intent on driving her wilder with need than she had ever been, until she surrendered to him and begged him for more. She stopped him in his tracks by snarling at him and seizing his other shoulder as her left hand returned to his neck. She shoved him against the wall by it, her grip so tight he had to drag his breaths down into his lungs with effort. Her kiss grew fiercer, a hard demand against his, her tongue stroking his before flickering over his fangs. The pleasure that rolled through him in response had him forgetting the tightness of her grip on his throat for a moment, drove it out of his mind for a few seconds, until he tried to kiss her back and she growled at him again, pressed him harder against the wardrobes. Prickles chased through his blood, followed by a wicked sort of darkness, an inkiness that swept through him, obliterating the light. Blue caught her shoulders and shoved her back, fought her as she tried to keep kissing him, her hisses and growls filling the air. He evaded her mouth, and she went to work on his jaw, searing him with each sweep of her lips and almost making him fall back under her spell as she drifted down to his throat and devoured it with wet kisses and nips of her sharp teeth. He shook his head to drive sense back into it, because something was wrong. "Taryn!" he barked and pushed her back, and this time he seemed to reach her because her eyes widened. But she didn't release him, and her body didn't stop shifting, writhing against the air, her face contorting as frustration flooded the link between them. She needed him. He knew that, felt it drumming in his blood, and he wanted to give his female what she desired, wanted to pleasure her until she was boneless on that bed, sated and sleepy in his arms. But something was very wrong. It had been a couple of days since they had touched, but his instinct said that her fervor was born of something more than their time apart. She tried to reach him again, but he locked his elbows, keeping her at a distance. Her eyes flashed fire and she roared at him, and then reared back, shock flittering across her face and through their connection, She looked down at her hands on him and her eyes widened, horror filling them when she spotted the one wrapped around his throat. She released him and staggered back, breathing hard against the panic he could feel welling up in her. "Taryn," he whispered and reached for her, needing to soothe her. She shook her head. "I need a moment," squeezed her eyes shut. "You need more than a moment. You need me. I can feel it in you, little dragon." He advanced on her and she backed away, shaking her head as she opened her eyes and they implored him to keep his distance. She feared losing control again. Gods, he feared it a little too, but he was equally as afraid of losing control of himself. He needed her now more than ever, his every instinct screaming at him to claim his mate at last, to make her belong to him forever, love him forever. She halted and pressed her thighs together, wriggled them and moaned, her cheeks flushed and eyes dark with desire. He could see her control fading again, slowly torn away from her by her instincts. He hadn't realized that the urge to mate would run as fiercely in her as it did in him. More fiercely, in fact. She was barely in control, writhing on the spot, so hungry for release that she couldn't keep still. It was his blood. She had drawn the smallest amount, not enough to seal their bond, and it was driving her mad with a need for more. He wanted to give that to her, as much as she wanted of him, completing their bond and tangling their fates forever. Fear flashed in her eyes, fear of losing her weak grip on herself and fear of hurting him. He feared the same things. "You're not alone, little dragon," he husked, and her eyes narrowed, lids falling to turn them hooded, and a small moan left her lips, as if he had spoken words of seduction rather than stated simple facts. He held his left hand out to her, and her gaze leaped to it, narrowed as she moaned again, wriggled and writhed, so hungry to take it and give in to him. She cast him a pained look and shook her head, tearing a sigh from him. "What is it you fear?" She swallowed hard, sounded breathless, on the verge of release. "Mating. It is too strong. The urge. I will hurt you. I am dangerous." Her breath left her in a rush, and she rocked back another step, her violet to white eyes glowing with fire, with need. "I am too dangerous like this." He wasn't about to deny that. She was stronger than he was, and her urge to mate was fierce, too powerful for her to fully control herself. There was a chance she would hurt him in the act, but he wasn't about to let something like that stop him. He stroked the scars on his neck, one she had given him, and her eyes followed his fingers, pain flashing in them. "Whatever you deal, I can heal, little dragon. There is nothing you can do that will stop me from claiming you." She moaned, squeezed her thighs, nibbled her lower lip in a way that made him growl and take swift steps toward her, unable to hold himself back any longer. He seized her mouth, sucked that lip into his, and nibbled it with his fangs. The sweet taste of her blood filled his mouth, and she moaned in unison with him, clamped her hands down on his shoulders and dragged him against her, so her bare front pressed against his. Her breasts were maddeningly soft against his chest, and he couldn't stop himself from rocking against the soft cushion of her belly. Another groan left him as his hard cock throbbed, aching for more. He needed to be inside her. Would go insane if he denied himself much longer. She squeaked against his lips as he swept her up into his arms, and then she was kissing him again, little breathless moans constantly escaping her as she drove him mad, pushing him right to the edge with only her mouth. Blue kneeled on the violet covers of the double bed and dropped her in the middle of it, covered her body with his and claimed her lips again. She moaned and wrapped her arms around his throat, raked short claws over his back, sending bolts of lightning zinging across his body. He growled against her lips with each one, each zap that had his blood burning hotter, the sparks of pain only heightening the pleasure he took from the feel of her beneath him, as wild for him as he was for her. "Need you," she moaned in the dragon tongue against his lips, and nipped at his lower one, her teeth nicking it and drawing blood. She growled low in her throat, a rumble he felt against his chest, and seized his mouth again, sucking fiercely on the tiny wound. She rocked against him, shoved and fought him, maneuvered beneath him until she could circle her legs around his hips. He hissed through clenched teeth as her slick heat scalded his throbbing cock, and she ground against it, her moans ripping at his control. He found enough of it to muster the strength to draw back, so he could slip his hand between them as he kissed her. She bucked against it as he palmed her, and he groaned as he felt how wet she was. Her nub pulsed against the heel of his hand, the desperate flickering making him want to forget everything and get inside her, because she needed him. Blue forced himself to resist that temptation and softened his kiss as he stroked her, teasing her towards a climax he hoped would help weaken the hold her mating instincts had on her. She wriggled beneath him, hot breaths washing across his face as she rode his fingers, moaned into his mouth and sank her claws into his shoulders. "Blue," she whispered, and he had never heard a sweeter sound than his name falling from her lips on a passion-drenched sigh. He slid his hand down, eased 2 fingers into her, and groaned at how hot, wet, and tight she was around them. She shuddered and clawed at him, mewled against his lips as he kissed her and stroked her, slowly withdrawing his fingers before easing back in. He rubbed the pad of his thumb over her clit, swallowed her sweet cries as she constantly undulated beneath him, her need flaring stronger in his veins as his connection to her blasted wide open, Taryn no longer able to hold anything back from him. Gods, it was beautiful. He drowned in her emotions as he touched her, teasing her towards release, feeling as if he was journeying there with her, so swept up in her that he shared every flicker of pleasure that danced through her. Every sharp breath that left her lungs left his too, and every gasping moan echoed in his throat. "Blue!" The desperation in her voice had him stroking her deeper, thumbing her harder, until she was as taut as a bowstring beneath him, quivering on the edge of release. He plunged his fingers deep into her, spearing her liquid core, and her hips jerked up. Her hands gripped him so tightly it felt as if his bones would crack beneath the pressure, and her sweet cry filled his ears. He grunted and rocked his hips, driving against thin air as she trembled around his fingers, throbbing madly. Pleasure flowed through him, bliss that felt as if it was his own release, and he lowered his head and kissed down her neck as he gently stroked her, easing her back down. She moaned with each little pulse of her body, ones that he loved to hear because she sounded as if she had no control over them, as if they left her of their own volition, born of surprise in the wake of each tremor. When her trembling subsided, she sank against the bed and her grip on him loosened. Loosened but didn't fall away. Her hands remained against him, short claws still pressing in, and as he lazily kissed her throat, he could feel her desire rising again, stoking the embers in her blood. She turned her face towards him, and he claimed her lips again, giving her what she wanted. Her kiss started tender, soft, and relaxed, but steadily grew in ferocity until it matched the hunger racing through his blood again, need that demanded he sate it. He rolled his hips against her, driving his cock against her belly, and she moaned, rocked up against him. "Blue," she whispered against his lips, voice a sweet drone that spoke of satisfaction but also frustration. He had given her release, but he hadn't given her what she needed. What they both needed. Her legs clamped around his waist, pulling him into hard contact with her, and he couldn't stop the groan that tumbled from his lips as her soft body trapped the aching length between them. He couldn't stop himself from rubbing against her, shuddering as the sensitive head tingled, and sparks of pleasure bolted down his shaft to his balls. Gods, he needed her. She snarled and kissed him hard, her teeth clashing with his and her claws slicing into his skin. Her body grew hotter, as if the fire in her veins was real and she was burning up, would turn to cinders if he didn't give her what she needed to cool her instincts. A mating. Just the thought of it had him rearing back, eager to claim her. He growled down at her, flashing his fangs as his ears grew pointier, flaring against the sides of his head. Her eyes widened and then fell half shut as a moan trembled on her lips, her hooded gaze only encouraging the part of him that roared to claim her, to make her submit to him as she had in the courtyard when they had been in their dragon forms. As if she knew his wicked thoughts, she scratched his shoulders and kicked at him, tried to shove him onto his back. The violet fire flashing in her eyes challenged him, warned that if he didn't drive her into submission, she would be the one to send him to his knees and take control. Blue bared his fangs on a snarl, grabbed her wrists and pinned them to the bed above her shoulders. She moaned, undulated with blatant desire in her eyes, arousal sparked by his dominance. He didn't know much about dragon mating, had only heard rumors that male dragons were brutal and dangerous when the hunger hit them. He was beginning to get the impression that the females were as dominant and violent as their male counterparts, and that Taryn had good reason to fear she would hurt him. Her face crumpled and she writhed beneath him, fighting his hold. Her eyes blazed violet fire, her lips peeled back to flash all sharp teeth at him. She wanted to fight him, to drive him into submission and dominate him. She wanted to be the one to claim him. It wasn't going to happen. "I said nothing would stop me, little dragon, and I meant that." He tightened his grip on her wrists, shoved them harder against the bed, and felt the flicker of delight and relief that lit her blood as he showed her just how strong he was, strong enough to handle her. "This is a mutual claiming, but you need me to be the one in control. Just focus on that, Kiara. Focus on me." She managed a nod, but whatever control she had gathered was short-lived. It fled her eyes and they burned again, aflame with dragon fire, and he could feel her fragile control slipping from her. Knew it would continue to leak from her until they had sealed their bond. He had wanted to do this gently, slowly, with reverence, but his little dragon was too far gone, her instincts too strong to deny, and she needed him to claim her in order to stop her from hurting him by staking a claim on him. They would do a gentler version of a claiming once her instincts as a dragon were satisfied, and they were finally mates. He gathered her wrists together, clutched them in one hand, and growled at her when she fought him. Flashing fangs seemed to be enough to placate her this time. Or it might have been the way he moved his hips back. Her eyes fell to his cock, grew hungry and heated, and she licked her lips when he lowered his hand and grasped his shaft. "Blue!" Her eyes leaped to his, begged him to fill her and claim her, to help her through the madness that had gripped her. She didn't want to hurt him. It beat in his blood, in their joined hearts. She was afraid of losing control. "Right here, little dragon," he murmured and lowered his hips, ran the head of his cock down through her moist folds, and moaned as it found her slick opening. He smiled down at her as she wriggled, mewled, and arched against him, desperation written across every beautiful line of her face. "Stay here with me, forever." She whispered breathlessly, "Forever." He drove into her and swallowed her low moan in a kiss. Her body quivered around his, white-hot and scalding, as if she really was on fire inside. He groaned and lifted his hand as he slowly thrust into her, brushed his knuckles across her cheek in a tender caress, before he ghosted his hand up her arm and took hold of her wrist again. He brought her arms down, pinned them to the bed near her shoulders, and kissed her as he drove into her, as gently as he could manage when it felt as if his blood was rolling towards a fiery boil too. She wriggled and bucked beneath him, raised her body until her chest was plastered to his, and her core clamped down on him. He grunted and thrust deeper, fought to keep a fragile hold on his control. She tore it from his grip when she bit down on his lip, sinking her sharp teeth into it. Blue's upper lip peeled off his aching fangs, and he growled at her, ripped free of her bite, and drove hard into her. She moaned, tipping her head back, her violet to white hair spilling around her shoulders, and fuck, she looked beautiful like that. Wanton, lost. He had never seen anything as erotic and intoxicating as the sight of Taryn spread beneath him, her body wrapped around his and her hands restrained by his. Every inch of her bared to him, not just her body but her emotions, her soul, her heart. Her eyes flicked open and her tongue dabbed at the blood on her lips, his blood. It dripped from the tear in his lower lip, splashed onto the pale skin of her chest, stark against it. Her eyes challenged him again, issued a demand that he was all too happy to satisfy. He dropped his head and licked the blood from her chest as he thrust into her, and she moaned and lifted her backside, allowing him to slide deeper still. He grunted against her chest, lost himself for a moment, giving the wildness and need spiraling out of control inside him a chance to seize hold of him. Her hips rose higher, he slid deeper. Her hunger shot through him, an urge that he couldn't stop himself from fulfilling. He bit down on her right breast. Taryn jerked against him and cried out, her body shuddering against his, her pleasure blasting through him. He growled when her blood hit his tongue, groaned as it slid down his throat, and made the mistake of letting the bliss of it consume him. The room whirled past him, the mattress slammed into his back, and strong little hands clamped around his wrists and shoved them down. She rode him mercilessly as he fed, ravenous for her blood and unable to tear himself away, even as a small voice whispered he was in danger. Her grip on his wrist slowly tightened, but he barely paid any notice to the way his fingers numbed, didn't give a damn as he lapped at her blood, let a bead roll down to her nipple and took it into his mouth. She moaned and writhed, rotated her hips, and drove him mad. If he was going to go insane, she was going there with him. He licked at her breast, sucked her nipple harder, pinched it between his teeth, hard. "Blue!" She jerked, her body squeezing his cock so hard it felt as if it would burst, and then she snarled. It was a bit of a blur after that. Her left hand seized his throat, pushed up to hit his jaw and shoved his head to his right, and then her fangs were in his neck, clamped down hard and made his blood explode into wildfire so hot he was sure it melted his gray matter because everything went topsy-turvy. The room spun, twirling into a maelstrom above him, and pleasure so intense it robbed him of his vision blasted through him, a hot, endless quivering that numbed him but left him alive with feeling at the same time. Colors danced across his vision as it slowly returned, but they weren't colors. The red, the violet, the passionate pink, the infinite blue. He could name them all. Desire, need, love, and the feeling of forever stretching before him and his mate. He could see her feelings, watch them blend with his as she drank deep of his vein, forging a powerful bond between them, a bond he needed to be stronger still. He couldn't hold back, had no control, and could only watch as he pulled the hair from her throat and sank his fangs into it, joining their bodies completely, eternally. She moaned, trembled, her body quivering around his, and he shuddered and groaned as her release drew another from him. He throbbed inside her, each pulse stealing a little more of his strength, a little more awareness from him, until he was boneless beneath her, unsure where she ended and he began. It felt as if they were one now, tangled together, never to part. He had taken her into him, and she had taken him into her, and now he could feel all of her. Every emotion that flowed through her flowed through him, and he knew the reverse was true. She could feel his love for her, just as he could feel hers for him. She knew without question that it was unconditional, infinite, a love that would never falter, never die. She was his forever, and he would be hers. Nothing would stand between them or stop that from happening. Nothing. Blue wrapped his arms around her when she released him, broke away from her neck at the same time as she left his, and kissed her with all of his heart, the heart she now owned. But as he lost himself in the bliss of this moment with her, the darkness that lurked at the edges of his mind began to close in, and in the aftermath of claiming her, he wasn't strong enough to shut it out. It whispered to him. He had claimed her as his mate, but he hadn't claimed their forever. He had won the battle for her heart, but there was still one more war to fight if he was going to secure their forever after. He had to slay a dragon for her. Chapter 35. Taryn had been awkward from the moment she had awoken in his arms after their mating. That had been 2 days ago. Blue flicked a glance at her and a blush climbed her cheeks, turning them rosy, and her fingers absently hovered over her breast, over the white leather that concealed the marks he had placed on her. He wasn't sure if he would ever tire of the way she blushed like that, how she couldn't seem to stop herself from reaching for her mating marks, and couldn't stop her striking eyes from drifting to his neck, to the marks she had placed on him. Blue fingered them, and her blush only deepened, and she cast her gaze down at her boots, the shy edge to her expression pushing him into action. He crossed the busy courtyard to her, navigating his way through the small army of demons who had gathered in preparation for the coming battle, his eyes never leaving her. When he was within a few meters, she slowly raised her gaze to him again, looking at him through her dark lashes, and though the shy edge remained, fire began to burn in her violet-to-white eyes. Her pupils dilated, her teeth toyed with her lower lip. Blue growled, his pointed ears flattening against the sides of his head, as the hunger he could feel in her raced through him too, demanding he whisk her away to some quiet corner of the garrison and satisfy them both. A demon stepped into his path, and Blue snarled at him. The snarl died on his lips when he met the black gaze of the male who towered before him, King Tegan of the Second Realm. The big black-haired demon king raised an eyebrow at his threat, but thankfully didn't seek to put him in his place. He merely looked over his wide shoulder at Taryn. When his eyes returned to Blue, they were darker than before, his pupils ringed by purple-red fire, and menace rolled off of him, sparking Blue's instincts. He spread his feet shoulder-width apart, adopting a fighting stance, ready for whatever King Tegan was about to throw at him. The male wanted to fight, and for some reason, seeing Blue heading for his mate had put him in the firing line. A large hand clamped down on the demon's shoulder, short dark claws emerging slightly as fingers closed over and pressed into sinewy muscle. "Perhaps it is best we leave the little elf to his business, King Tegan. I am sure Prince Lauren would be more than happy to answer whatever question you desired to ask the commander." Thorn's rough, deep voice rumbled around Blue, and he flicked a glance at the third king. Thorn's chiseled features softened into a smile as Tegan looked across at him, and the breath Blue hadn't realized he had been holding rushed from his lungs, as the bigger demon gave a curt nod and allowed Thorn to lead him away. Question Blue's arse. Tegan hadn't had something to ask him, he'd had something to tell him, with fist, fang, and claw for some reason. Blue looked at his beautiful mate, and then over his shoulder at Tegan's bare back as Thorn led him through the crowd towards Lauren. Now that he was thinking about it, there had been a marked change in Tegan's behavior since leaving the castle. The Demon King had been genial during the meeting prior to Blue's mating with Taryn, but since then he had given Blue the cold shoulder, and whenever Blue had approached him about preparing his part of the army, the male had looked ready to kill him. Blue had put it down to stress of leading his men, coupled with a dash of excitement about finally getting his claws bloody again. Now Blue suspected the change in attitude had little to do with the impending war, and a lot to do with Blue's newly mated status. It seemed Grave wasn't the only male with a chip on his shoulder about a female. Blue looked back at Taryn and caught her glaring in Tegan's direction, her eyes bright violet and shimmering like fire. His fierce little dragon. The sight of her warmed his heart. She had noticed the hostility between him and the Demon King, and she wanted to put the bigger male in his place. He stared at her as he strode towards her, and her glare slowly faded, her eyes drifting back to him, and that pretty blush rising onto her cheeks again. "How a prepara—" Blue cut her off, sweeping her into his arms and claiming her mouth. She stiffened, moaned, and wrapped her arms around his neck. The tension melted from her as she kissed him, and his faded too, purged by the feel of her in his arms. Her body pressed against his, and their mouths fused. Gods, she felt perfect against him. She kissed him deeper, stroked her tongue along his, teased his emerging fangs, and then broke away, breathless. Her wicked smile sent heat shooting straight to his cock, and the way she seized his hand had him forgetting his duties and all too eager to go along with whatever his mate wanted, because it looked as if she wanted him. She tugged him towards the far side of the courtyard, towards where it was quiet. Blue growled low in his throat, pulled her back into his arms, and went to sweep her up into them so he could teleport them both there. A horn sounded. He cursed in the elf tongue. Taryn muttered, "Fuck." He almost grinned at that, She was certainly embracing the one mortal swear word she knew. He was tempted to teach her others once the battle was over and their forever began, because there was something charming about the words when she said them, so out of place in amidst her formal way of speaking that it tickled him. Blue set her down and away from him, and forced himself to turn back, towards the gathering army that filled the courtyard of the garrison. A wall of bare muscular back stood between him and the point where Lauren stood on the broad stone stairs that led up to the walls, a mixture of demons from 3 separate kingdoms. He sighed, cursed the gods for their timing, and her brother for interrupting them. If he had needed a reason to kill Tanak, the male had just given him one. Taryn's fingers slipped between his, and he looked down at their joined hands, and then up into her eyes. They told him everything. How much she loved him, how fiercely she needed him, but also every fear that filled her heart. It was time. Blue didn't want his mate to hurt, but he also knew nothing he could do would end her pain. All he could do was remain close to her during the battle, offering her his support and his love as she fought her own flesh and blood with the intent of killing him. Tanak's death would spare all of hell from suffering at his hands, but it wouldn't spare Taryn. It would deal a blow to her that would be every ounce of pain everyone would have experienced at her brother's hands rolled into one consuming agony that he feared would tear her apart. It was going to take her time to overcome the grief and guilt she would feel, but he would be there for her, would do everything in his power to ease her pain and hold her together. He wouldn't let her slip away from him. He wouldn't lose her. Her hand trembled in his, and he tightened his grip on her, silently telling her that he was there for her, and vowing that he was going to do whatever he could to make this easier on her. Heat shimmered across his skin beneath his armor as her gaze landed on him, the fire she always stirred in his blood rushing back to the fore, making him burn all over again for her. He slowly lowered his eyes to meet hers, held them as he lifted his free hand and brushed the knuckles across her soft cheek. Her eyes slipped shut, and he inhaled hard as she leaned into his touch. He opened his palm and cupped her face, sighed as she shook against it, and swept his thumb across her cheek. "I am here with you, little dragon," he whispered in her tongue, and her violet eyebrows furrowed. A second later they drew down, and her jaw tensed, her lips flattening. He could feel the internal war she waged, the ferocious battle between fear and pain, and her natural strength and courage, and the thought that she was doing the right thing. "I will always be with you." Her eyes opened and leaped up to his, and his heart went out to her as they searched his, an edge of desperation about them, backing up her feelings that flowed into him through their bond. She needed more reassurance, needed him to soothe her and hand victory to her courage and the strength that was pushing her to spare hell her brother's wrath by taking his life. "I love you, Taryn," he murmured, and her eyebrows furrowed again, and then she was in his arms, hers snaking around his neck to draw him down to her. Blue slid his arms around her waist, pulled her close to him, and kissed her. She sank against him, and he held her up, giving her his strength, hoping she would feel that he would give her every last drop of it if she needed it from him. He would be her pillar. She could lean on him, now and forever. He broke the kiss and pressed his forehead against hers, raised his hands and framed her face with them. "I will be there with you. I will not leave your side. Never." "Blue." His name was a breathless whisper on her lips, and it told him everything she couldn't say. It conveyed how much his being with her meant to her, that she was going to hold him to his words. He hadn't broken a promise to her yet, and he wasn't about to start now. Lauren's voice rose in the silent morning air, but Blue paid him no heed as he held his mate, opened his heart to her and let her feel everything through their deep bond, holding nothing back. She drew down a deep breath, and he felt the change in her, the shift as her heart grew stronger, and she slayed her fears and doubts, and rose to the challenge ahead of her. His strong little female. Taryn's hands closed over his and drew them away from her face. She smiled as she pressed soft kisses to his knuckles and then opened her eyes and lifted them to his. The fear that had colored them was gone now, leaving behind the formidable female he had encountered more than once on the battlefield. She nodded, a small action but one that said she had made her mind up and she was ready. He lowered their joined hands, released her left but kept hold of her right. He slipped his fingers between hers, squeezed her hand tight, and led her through the crowd. They skirted the edges, picking a path through the demons of the third realm, heading towards Lauren where he stood on the steps with King Thorn, King Tegan, and Queen Melia of the demons, and Prince Vale, Rosalind, Sable, and Olivia. When his steady gaze landed on Sable as she busied herself with checking her throwing knives and crossbow, Taryn loosed a low growl. Blue dropped his eyes to his mate. She blushed hard, but her gaze didn't leave his. It held firm, challenging him to say something about her jealous outburst. He couldn't, not when he wanted to growl whenever she looked at another male. Gods, he was as bad as Vale. He had thought the urge to strike down any male who looked at her, mated or unmated, would pass when he had claimed her as his forever. But it hadn't abated at all. Blue paused in the middle of the throng of warriors, turned to her and caught her other hand. He sent his armor away from his chest and neck, a ripple of cold following the scales as they rushed over his flesh, leaving it bare. He raised her hand and placed it on the marks on his neck, a series of puncture wounds that were still healing and perfectly matched her sharp little fangs. "Yours, remember?" he husked, and the heat on her cheeks had nothing to do with embarrassment, as she lowered her eyes to his throat and her marks. "Always?" she murmured and stroked the marks. And fuck, he wanted to do the same to hers. Her soft caress sent a fiery shiver through him, and he bit back a groan. He nodded. "Forever." Her smile blew him away. She fingered the scabs, following the curve of them, and her eyes began to blaze, a slow, steady burn that had him thinking about heading back in the direction they had come. Lauren's deep voice shattered the silence again, and the spell Taryn had cast on him with it. He sighed at the same time as her, made a silent promise that they would finish this after the battle was done, and called his armor back. The black scales rushed over his bare skin, warm against it, and Taryn snatched her hand back as if they were going to bite her. He smiled when she muttered under her breath about preferring him as he had been, half naked. "I'm sure you don't prefer me completely naked, little dragon," he husked as he continued to lead her through the crowd. The sudden spark of desire that lit her blood bolted through his too, courtesy of their bond. And fuck, he had to stop teasing her now that they were mated. It was torture. His primal instinct to please his female had been strong enough before, a force that had him panting to pleasure her whenever she needed. But now it was a divine sort of torture, one that hijacked control and had him rock hard in an instant, ready for her. He felt her gaze on his backside as he walked, could almost hear her low purr of approval, and the wicked thoughts running rampant through her pretty head. Holy fuck. He glared over his shoulder at her, but she didn't repent. She just smiled at him and had the audacity to give him a saucy wink. Minx. She was determined to keep his eyes on her and off other females, and she was doing a damned good job of it. He didn't mind her scrambling his mind with lust, but he needed to focus. He hadn't heard any of what Lauren was droning on about, and while he was sure it was just a standard speech to rouse the troops, it wouldn't reflect well on him if his prince questioned him and discovered he hadn't been listening. Gods, he could well imagine how Lauren would tease him. He doubted Lauren would be alone, too. Olivia would be his co-conspirator, and he was 99% certain that Thorn and Sable would join in. Hell, Vale and Rosalind would probably take a poke or two at him, too. He didn't even want to imagine how Leif would berate him if he knew. He flicked a glance off to the right of Lauren where the elves had gathered, split into divisions led by Leif, Finn, and Dacian. His 3 warriors stood at the head of each legion, arms folded across their armored chests, all of them paying attention to their prince as he spoke. They were doing a better job of being a perfect soldier than he was right now. But finding his mate had been a long time coming, and he was still searching for balance, trying to grow accustomed to the new instincts and feelings flowing through him. That was his excuse, and he was going to stick with it, because he knew Lauren would forgive him if he blamed it all on his beautiful new mate. Blue reached the bottom of the stone steps just as Lauren finished and turned to the small group who would command sections of the army. "Rosalind, are you ready?" Lauren said, and the petite blonde witch nodded. Vale shifted foot to foot beside her, his violet irises already black around their edges. He fiddled with the black and silver bands around his wrists, his serrated claws scratching at them. When Rosalind placed her hand on his forearm, he hissed at her, flashing huge fangs as his pointed ears flared back against his blue-black hair. His face crumpled a moment later as he realized what he had done, and he shoved his fingers through his hair, held his head and dug the points of his claws into his scalp. Blue wished he could revive the dark witch Cordula, the female responsible for Vale's pathological hatred of magic, and kill her all over again. Rosalind turned towards her mate, skimmed her hands up his forearms, gently took hold of his wrists, and carefully drew his hands away from his head. The points of his black claws glistened with his own blood in the bright light. She sighed, brought them to her mouth, and kissed each one, staining her lips crimson. Vale growled, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her hard. Complicated wasn't a strong enough word to describe his prince. He balanced on the brink of insanity whenever he felt magic, but he couldn't get enough of his mate. Blue had thought fate had been cruel to him by making his mate a witch when one had tortured him so vilely, but he was beginning to see that Rosalind was the balm Vale's heart and head needed in order to heal. It was there in the way she cradled him gently in her arms, even though he was being rough with her, his claws digging into her hips as he kissed her hard, dominating her. She stroked the back of his head, returned the kiss, and Vale slowly calmed, until he was being gentle with his mate, kissing her softly, making Blue want to take Taryn into his arms and kiss her like that. Lauren cleared his throat. Vale lifted his head, a distant look in his clear violet eyes as they shifted to his older brother. Leif, Dacian, and Finn joined the party, and Blue nodded as he looked beyond Lauren to them. They would lead the elves in his stead and command a legion each. Close to 1,000 elves apiece was a huge step up for them, but he was sure they would each excel, even Finn. The wisecracking male was unusually sober today. Blue could understand why. The fate of their kingdom and hell rested in their hands, a kingdom that included Finn's sister and family. Blue was glad that Iolanthe was in the mortal realm, far away from the battle about to take place. Rosalind, Vale. Lauren turned from one to the other, nodding as they did the same. Vale closed his eyes and steeled himself. Rosalind placed her hands on her mate's face, cupping his cheeks, and shut her blue eyes. She swayed on the spot as she muttered soft words in the old Fey tongue. Colorful sparks of light drifted from her fingers and danced in the still air, illuminating Vale's face as it twisted, and he snarled. Focus, Vale. I am here, Lauren whispered, and settled his hand on his brother's left shoulder. Vale relaxed again. I feel it, he murmured, a frown pinching his black eyebrows. The sword is close, beyond the mountains. Lauren looked down at Vale's hands as they curled into tight fists. The scent of blood filled the air, and Blue frowned as it seeped from the cracks between Vale's fingers, and dropped to the gray stone steps. Enough, Lauren snapped, but Vale shook his head. It is near the border. A small settlement. Vale gritted his teeth and his face contorted, and the sense of danger that he always emitted rose sharply. Stop, Lauren barked. Rosalind opened her eyes and looked between Lauren and her mate, her blue eyes swirling with silver stars. A little more. He can take it. He cannot, Lauren countered and reached for her hands. Vale bared his fangs on a snarl. More. I can take more. Lauren looked as if he wanted to argue that he couldn't and snatched Rosalind's hands away from his brother, freeing him of her spell, but he lowered his hand instead and huffed. Olivia sidled closer to her mate, and Lauren glanced down at her, a wealth of hurt in his eyes. She smiled softly, her dark eyes sparkling with it, and reached for his hand. Blue's senses blared a warning. He shoved Taryn down the steps and lunged for Lauren just as Vale turned on him, his lips peeling back off his enormous fangs. He pulled Lauren out of the path of Vale's attack, and Vale's claws raked down his chest, breaking through his armor in places. Fire burned in their wake, and Blue grunted as he staggered backwards into Lauren, knocking him off the steps. Olivia shrieked his name and rushed after him. Rosalind bit out something harsh in the old Fey tongue and launched at her mate. Blue snapped his hand around Vale's throat before she could reach him and kicked off, slamming the male into the stone wall. Vale's breath left him in a sharp puff, but the shock that rippled across his face quickly morphed into darkness, anger so black that Blue shuddered as he felt it wrap around him. Tainted, but not lost, not yet. He shoved Vale hard against the wall, and the male lashed out with his left hand, claws aimed at his throat. Blue caught it and pinned it above his head. "You do not want to fight me, Prince Vale," Blue snarled in the elf tongue. Vale stilled, the fury draining from his face as he stared at Blue, a flicker of confusion in his black eyes. Violet seeped back into them, driving the black back, and he looked down at Blue's arm in front of him and then back up into his eyes and blinked. "Blue?" Vale's face crumpled, and Blue's heart bled for him as he looked around him, an edge of despair in his eyes. They came back to Blue, and he shook his head. "I never wanted to fight you." "I know," Blue whispered, and slowly loosened his hold on his prince, allowing him to find his feet again. Vale sagged against the wall, and Rosalind rushed in to fuss over him. Blue backed away, holding Vale's violet gaze, reading what he couldn't bring himself to voice. He was sorry. Not for what had just happened, but for what had transpired millennia ago, and in the centuries that had followed. Blue nodded, accepting the silent apology. "I know." "Vale." Lauren leaped back up onto the steps and joined Rosalind in checking Vale over, ignoring everyone as they advised him to be more careful. Blue didn't join them. Vale wasn't a threat to Lauren. He loved his brother, and it killed him whenever he lashed out at Lauren. He had only lashed out at Lauren because he had been the one closest to Vale when the flow of magic around him had made him snap. He took the few steps down towards Taryn, and she came to meet him, fussed over him in her own way by planting her hands on her hips and glaring at him. "I thought we tackled things together now," she said in the dragon tongue. Blue shook his head. "Not this. Never this. Vale is volatile, and I won't let him near you. It is safer that I deal with him alone when he is like this." She smiled, and he frowned at her, confused as to why she was looking at him as if he was wonderful. "You knew he would not hurt you," she said, and his frown deepened as he supposed that he did. He had placed himself between Vale and Lauren on instinct, but that instinct had said that Vale wouldn't hurt him, that out of everyone present, he was the one who could reach his prince, just as he had that day on the battlefield 42 centuries ago. "You have forgiven him." Blue considered that and slowly nodded as it dawned on him that he had forgiven Vale in a way. He hadn't absolved Vale of his sins, because that was something only Vale could do by making amends for his actions. But he had forgiven him for the pain he had caused him, and the years they had come to blows. "I want you to remain in the garrison with Rosalind," Lauren said, and a low growl erupted behind Blue. He stepped to one side, allowing Taryn to claim her place beside him again, and looked across at Vale where he still rested against the wall with Rosalind clutching his arm. "No," Vale snapped, flashing fangs. "I will not leave your side, brother. Not again." The look in Lauren's eyes said that he wanted that more than anything. It wasn't possible. Lauren had fought hard to convince the Elf Council that they needed Rosalind's assistance in this battle, and that meant allowing Vale to enter the kingdom. The elders had agreed to Vale's presence in their realm, but Blue had the feeling that welcome had a time limit attached to it. As soon as the battle was done, they would want Vale gone. Blue found himself hoping again that Vale could do something that would help his cause, at least enough that he could visit Lauren without the castle going on red alert and hunting him down. Lauren placed his hand on Vale's shoulder, sighed, and nodded. "Remain close to me." Vale nodded. In the silence that fell, the elf prince dropped a bombshell that Blue was going to make damn sure reach the elders on his behalf, because it was perfect for gaining him a reprieve. "I know the exact location of the sword." Chapter 36. Fucking Valestrum. Blue shuddered as he fought his way through the enemy horde, cutting down demons and fae with his double-ended spear. Of all the places Tenak could have chosen as his base of operations, he had chosen the ghostly settlement near the border of the Free Realm. A town that had been abandoned since Vale had slaughtered hundreds of elves in his own legion here 4,000 years ago. No wonder Vale had lost himself to the darkness when he had pinpointed the location of the sword through Rosalind's spell. Valestrum had been a bustling settlement then, a place where people of the Free Realm and elves had traded goods, acting as a market that had drawn hundreds to it each day. The stone buildings lay in ruin now, the clock tower still rising above the roofless, squat houses that lined the main crossroad and circled the market square at its center. Blue flicked a glance back at Vale, checking on him as they fought close to each other, in the rear half of the attack. Lauren's gaze lit on him and then his brother, and Blue could almost feel his relief as he saw that Vale was still holding it together, somehow retaining control. He had tried to convince Vale to take Lauren's advice and remain at the garrison with Rosalind, but Vale had insisted on coming with them, stating over and over that he was strong enough to fight the darkness and the memories that would provoke it. He had told them the same thing so many times that he had sounded as if he had been trying to convince himself more than everyone else. The only thing Blue was convinced of was that it was only a matter of time before the memories of this place, the horror Vale had inflicted here at the start of Cordula's reign over him, took over and the darkness seized hold of him. He knew it because the memories of that terrible night were pushing at him too, goading his darkness, and it was growing difficult to hold it back as he tried to harness the strength of it at the same time, in order to fight to the best of his abilities. The tip of his black spear sliced upwards across the bare chest of a demon from the seventh realm, and the huge male staggered back, snarled as he looked down at his chest and touched the crimson gash, and then kicked off, launching himself at Blue. Blue teleported as the male reached him, reappearing behind the demon in time to see him stumbling through the shimmering ghostly form he had left behind. He slashed again, cutting deeply up the demon's back. The male grunted and staggered a few steps before he collapsed to his knees and then kissed the churned earth. Blood pooled swiftly in his lower back and ran to the ground, staining the crushed blades of grass red. Before this battle was done, the whole of the valley would be crimson. The snarls and cries of the warriors around him as they clashed filled his ears, but he paid them no heed as he checked on Vale again. His gaze caught on a large elf male sprinting across the uneven terrain, a black blade held point down in his fist, running in the opposite direction to the battle. Blue slowly turned his head, following the male's trajectory, and his eyes widened and tracked back. Lauren fought two demon males, his twin blades a blur as he ducked and dodged, lashed out to deal blows that would weaken his opponents. Blue's violet gaze leaped back to the elf male charging towards him. His eyes were black. A cold judder racked Blue, realization that hit him so hard he rocked back on his heels before he kicked off, sprinting hard towards his prince. The male wasn't running to help Lauren. Darkness embraced Blue as he leaped over a fallen fey female and cold swirled around him, and he willed the fates to listen to him as he jumped into his portal and get him to his destination before the male reached Lauren. He dropped out of the air just as the elf launched his blade at Lauren and thrust his spear forwards, ramming it deep into the male's side. The sudden jerk to the right the male made as Blue drove him to the ground wasn't enough to throw his aim off, and Blue could only shout as the black knife flew at Lauren's back. He pulled his spear free as the blade connected, striking Lauren in the right shoulder and slicing straight through his black armor. Lauren toppled forwards as he bellowed in agony and hastily swept his obsidian sword out to block the silver blade the nearest demon aimed at his neck. Blue raced across the battlefield and snarled as he reached Lauren, just as the demon struck again, more force behind the blow of his broadsword this time. Blue swept his spear up, grimaced and grunted through clenched teeth, as it clashed hard with the male's blade, and vibrations ran along its length, numbing his hands. He shoved upwards with his double-ended spear, knocking the demon back, and spun on his heel, bringing the second blade of his spear around in a deadly arc. It sliced through the demon's exposed stomach, and Blue didn't bother to watch him fall as he gargled, the scent of his blood flooding the air around him. He rushed to Lauren and caught him as he dropped to his knees. "Lauren!" Blue barked and growled at the blade protruding from his back, his fangs lengthening as rage threatened to consume him. "Tenak, he must have—" Lauren breathed hard and snarled through his own fangs, his face contorting as he tried to sit back, with more than pain this time. He was angry. Blue could feel it, and he wanted to tell Lauren not to beat himself up about the fact this had happened. It wasn't his fault. Lauren hunched forwards again, clutched his shoulder with his left hand, and grunted. An unholy roar shook the battlefield, and the air swirled around them, darkness rushing over Blue like an oily tide, pulling his even closer to the surface. Blue fought it back and looked up at Vale where he towered over Lauren, his near-black eyes wild with fury that rolled off him. Blue bit out, "Tenak has turned the tainted in our ranks against us." Tainted were weak, vulnerable to control by witches. The way Vale's gaze narrowed, his irises turning completely black, and he lifted his head to scent the air, said that he knew what Blue had been trying to say without mentioning the W word or bringing up magic. Vale spared Lauren a glance, and the moment Lauren looked up at his younger brother with fury mingled with regret written in every line of his face, Vale nodded and teleported, leaving an icy chill in his wake. Screams erupted on the battlefield around them, and Blue looked over his shoulder, barely able to keep up with Vale as he went to town on their own ranks, hunting out any tainted like a bloodhound, as if he could recognize the disease in other elves because he was so dangerously acquainted with it. "Gods," Lauren muttered and lowered his head, his eyes falling shut. The muscle in his jaw popped and he ground out, "It will be too much for him." Blue felt Lauren's fear because it beat in his heart too. Vale had undertaken an unsavory task, one most elves would have refused. Not every tainted on the battlefield had been turned against them. For all they knew, only that one male had been corrupted by magic. The effect hunting his own kind would have on most elves was nothing compared with the effect it would have on Vale, a male who was still coming to terms with the sheer number of elves he had murdered under Cordula's control. If this nightmare Vale had thrown himself into didn't gain him favor with the elders, Blue was going to see that their heads rolled. Vale deserved a damned medal for leaping into action as he had. "Rosalind needs to be here," Lauren muttered and tried to stand. His knees gave out and Blue steadied him as he breathed hard, fighting the pain. "I have to remove this." Blue eyed the dagger protruding from Lauren's shoulder, and his prince nodded. "It will hurt." Lauren shot him a black look, one that said he damned well knew that, and gritted his teeth before nodding stiffly. Blue gripped the handle of the blade and yanked it hard, pulling it free as quickly as he could manage. Lauren's bellow drowned out the din of the battle around them as he lurched forwards in Blue's arms. When he had run out of air, his cry fading as he exhausted it, he sank against Blue and breathed hard. The strong scent of Lauren's blood filled Blue's senses, and he frowned as he eased Lauren away enough to check the wound. It was deep. He wouldn't be able to fight with both hands, and that made him vulnerable. "Gods damn it!" Lauren growled, and then flashed his fangs on a snarl as he threw his left hand forwards. Two demon males and a fae who had been fighting their way towards them flew through the air as the blast of telekinesis hit them. Blue kept his mouth shut, aware that he didn't need to tell his prince what he was about to do. Lauren was royally pissed, angry enough that Blue could see he already knew what was about to go down. He closed his eyes, held Lauren against him, and willed his portal. Green-purple light chased over both him and Lauren, and then darkness swallowed them. When it parted, they were on the hill outside the garrison, more than 2 leagues from the battle. "Damn it!" Lauren bit out again and tried to shove onto his feet. Blue rose onto his and helped Lauren stand. Blood pumped down his back, turning the black scales of his armor shiny, making Blue feel sick to the pit of his stomach. Gods! What if he hadn't reached Lauren? What if he had been too distant from his friend to notice the elf male? Lauren could have been killed. His blood chilled, but then warmed as Lauren's left arm wrapped around him and tugged him hard against him, causing his chin to hit his prince's shoulder. His friend's shoulder. He had been wrong. Olivia hadn't replaced him. It echoed around his numb mind as Lauren held him, and he felt how close he had been to losing him. "Thank you," Lauren said. Blue's eyes slipped shut, warmth curling through him at the familiarity of that voice, at the reassurance that his friend was safe and would be healed soon. He pulled back and cleared his throat, rolled his shoulders in a shrug that felt anything but casual. "It was nothing. I was just doing my job." Lauren's eyes searched his. "As my second in command?" Gods, Blue was about to sound like a sappy prick, but he couldn't stop himself from saying, "As a friend." Lauren dragged him back into an embrace that only made him feel more awkward. He patted his prince's back, clumsily. "We're not that close," Blue muttered, and Lauren chuckled and released him. The smile on Lauren's lips died as his violet gaze drifted away from Blue, settling on a point in the distance behind him. Blue looked there, aware of the battle taking place just a few miles from them, feeling an urgent need to return to it, and ensure that Vale was safe too, and the others. 3 demon kings, a mortal huntress, and 3 idiotic elf warriors fought there, battling an army of demons, fae, witches, and other species. The dragons were yet to make an appearance, but it was only a matter of time before they joined the war. "Tenak might anticipate our attack if he is using the same tactics." Lauren's voice was a low whisper, concern thickening it. Blue nodded. "It's still the best plan we have, and we must give it a shot. The time is drawing near. According to Terran, her brother prefers to have his army weaken the enemy before he enters the battlefield to claim victory. I haven't scented a dragon there yet, and our numbers are falling. Our time to act is coming." He looked towards the squat garrison below him, his senses reaching out to his mate. She had been annoyed when he had ordered her to remain with the others in the safety of the stone bastion, until he had explained that he would return when it was time for them to head out and put their plan into action. Every instinct he possessed as a warrior said that time was now. Blue helped Lauren down the hill, his arms slung around his prince's waist to support him. Lauren muttered dark things in the elf tongue beneath his breath, his rage still simmering in his violet eyes. He had no doubt that as soon as he was patched up and healing, he would be back on the battlefield. He wanted to tell him to remain in the garrison, but he couldn't bring himself to say those words when he thought about Vale alone out there. If it was Iolanthe in his place, and Blue the one forced to retreat, he would be just as anxious to return to the fight and to her. The elves milling around outside the garrison, assigned to protecting those within it should the enemy reach them, all jerked their heads in his direction as he approached. Several pairs of eyes widened as they landed on Lauren, and then they were rushing towards them. Lauren waved them away as they all tried to help him. Blue led his friend through the main arched doors of the garrison and into the courtyard. "Shit!" A female voice rang through the silence and feet pounded the stone flags. Lauren lifted his head, his expression softened and he straightened, tipped his chin up and stood tall despite the pain Blue could feel in him. Olivia's hands fluttered as she reached them and she checked her mate over, her dark eyes wide and brimming with tears. "What the fuck happened?" It wasn't like Lauren's princess to swear, and it caused half of the elves in the courtyard to stop and stare. Lauren growled at them all, flashing his fangs, and they hurried away, leaving the courtyard quiet and empty save him, Blue, and Olivia. And Terran. She rushed out of the building in the center of it and raced over to him, her striking eyes filled with the fear that he could feel flowing through their link. He smiled, hoping to show her that the blood all over him wasn't his and that he was fine. Olivia took Lauren from him, and Lauren threw him a pained and pleading look as she led him away, chastising him and talking about administering elf medicine. Lauren had little love for the medicine she spoke of, just like Blue, but he knew his prince would stomach it this once, just so he could quickly return to the battle, if Olivia would let him go. Blue had the feeling he was going to have to break Lauren out of the infirmary in order to get him back to the battlefield. Olivia was already talking about days' worth of bed rest, despite her mate's protest that it was just a knife in the back and he would be fine with a little fluids, his hungry gaze hovering on her neck. Terran collided with him, knocking the air from Blue's lungs, and he didn't have a chance to speak. Her lips clashed with his, arms holding him so tightly that it bordered on painful. He wrapped his around her, pulled her close, and kissed her back, letting her know that he had missed her too, and soaking up the comforting feel of her in his arms. "Gods, I was worried about you," she whispered against his lips in the dragon tongue, and pressed her forehead to his. "I can hear the battle. I have been watching from the walls, but cannot see what is happening. The reports coming back with the wounded say that we have heavy losses. I need to be out there. I have to stop this madness." Blue gathered her closer and pressed a kiss to the tip of her nose, and then claimed her mouth again, savoring the kiss as she instantly responded, a sweet, desperate edge to her kiss. She really had been worried. "It is time," he murmured and drew back, his eyes leaping between hers as he reached for their bond, strengthening it so he could feel whether she was ready, truly prepared for what they were about to do. Her resolve came through loud and clear, but there was pain and fear there with it. He lifted his hands and framed her face, kept her eyes locked on his as he brushed his thumbs across her cheeks, absorbing her beauty, his mate, his Kiara. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, unable to stop himself from posing that question, needing to give her a chance to go back on their plan. He would go alone if she did, would fight her brother for her. The resolve in her eyes grew stronger, shone so brightly it was dazzling. His strong, brave, beautiful little dragon. She nodded, snarled. "I will end this." Chapter 37. Taryn surveyed the battle stretching below her from her perch on the side of the nearest mountain, struggling to focus on the clash of the two armies as her neck throbbed close to her shoulder. Blue's recent bite demanding she give him and the hunger he had roused in her all of her attention. He stood beside her, his violet gaze on the warriors far below them, looking for all the three realms as if his focus was there. She knew it was really on her, on the need that had sparked inside him the moment her blood had hit his tongue, desire that had been a low simmer in her blood over the past day or so, steadily climbing towards a boil at times. Every time fate would intervene and ruin their plans. She needed her mate and he needed her. It was there in his eyes whenever he looked at her, in their bond if she focused just a little on it, strengthening it. God, she needed him. Her eyes scanned the warriors as they fought, swords clashing, bodies slamming, fists smashing and claws slashing. It was brutal, but she needed to see it. She had witnessed demon wars before, but they had never been on this scale, and the males involved had never been so vicious, violent beyond compare. Her brother had caused this. Blue had informed her that his madness had even reached a terrible peak, his disease infecting elves and turning them against their own kind. Her gaze picked out Prince Vale where he fought, his brother Lauren close beside him. They were near the back of the battle, forming a line with a mixture of demons and elves meant to cut down any enemy forces who made it that far, and were close to breaking through to reach the garrison. She shifted her eyes right, to the middle of the mad throng, where King Thorn of the Third Realm of the Demons fought hard beside his mate, the two working in a majestic symphony as they twisted and turned, backs pressed together one moment and breaking apart the next. They seemed to always know where the other was without looking. Their bond was strong. Beautiful. A bond similar to the one she shared with Blue. She had been able to feel him on the battlefield when she had been back at the garrison with Lauren's mate Olivia, trying to help the mortal doctor as she patched up the wounded teleported away from the front lines. Olivia's worry about her mate had been infectious, sinking deep claws into Taryn, making her tense and cranking her fear higher with each dull echo of pain on her body that had come from Blue and her connections to him. She had been so relieved when he had returned. She lifted her hands to her chest and pressed them to her heart, a heart that beat for him now. Blue's warm hand settled on her bare shoulder and she glanced at him, reassured him with a smile when he looked concerned. He returned it, his lips curling at the corners, his violet eyes sparkling with love. She absorbed the warmth of his caress when he brought his hand away from her shoulder and brushed his knuckles across her cheek. Her eyes began to slip shut. A mighty roar rose above the din of the battle, and her heart leaped, her gaze seeking the source of the sound. Her brother? The pounding of her heart eased when she found the male and saw that it was Tegan who had unleashed such a vicious and feral noise, the second king of the demons. The burly black-haired male fought right at the front and center of their side, leading the charge, an impressive sight with his black horns flared and his huge obsidian wings on display. He hacked down any who dared to attack him, his broadsword a silver blur, and his bare chest stained crimson with the blood of his foes. She had never seen anything like him. He was brutal as he swept through his adversaries like a wraith, his black wings assisting him as he dodged blows meant to cleave him in two from swords as huge as his own, wielded by demons from many different realms. He towered over them all, a formidable and deadly male, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he plowed a course through his enemy. Demons from the second realm followed on his heels, dispatching any he had injured and left in his wake, tackling the fae and demons who tried to reach their king from the sides as he constantly cut a straight line through their brethren. Her gaze tracked their leader. He held nothing back, led the charge, and never hesitated. He roared again, and the enemy forces seemed to still for a second as it rolled across the land, all eyes drawn in his direction. They feared him. She could understand why. It was as if one of the devil's demons had come to war with them, not a male from a peaceful kingdom. She tore her gaze away from him and looked towards where he was heading, charting the path he would take if he remained on his current course. Her blood chilled as she saw the large black tent near the edge of a ruined settlement, surrounded by smaller red ones. As she saw the male emerging from it, his eyes on the battle played out in front of him. Tenak. Damn, Blue bit out beside her, and her eyes darted to him. His were fixed on the battle below. Taryn looked there and wanted to echo him as she spotted the second king on his knees, a blade sticking out of his chest and a demon towering over him. The male pulled his broadsword free and spun on his heel, and Taryn didn't want to watch as he aimed it at King Tegan's throat, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. Chills raced over her skin, and she swiftly prayed to the gods that his men would reach him in time, even when she knew they wouldn't. The blade reached the second king's throat. Taryn's breath caught. A female appeared between the two males, shoved her arm against the enemy demon's one and caught it in her hand, stopping him just as his blade was about to slice through King Tegan's neck. The small female leaped at the enemy male, and Taryn's breath left her in a painful rush, and Blue's muttered curse swam around her head, as the female didn't attack the male as both of them had expected. She kissed him. Was the female involved with that demon? Taryn shook that thought away. No female would throw herself at a lover during a battle, especially when he had been about to claim a victory the size of the one the demon warrior had been close to seizing. But nothing else made sense. Until the demon male fell to his knees, the female nimbly leaped away at the perfect moment to land on her feet beside him, and watched as he crumpled onto his side. She leveled a hard kick at his head, turned, and stilled. The female rushed to the second king, kneeled and gathered him into her arms, disappeared with him. Taryn's eyebrows shot up. Beside her, Blue let out a low whistle. I wasn't expecting that. She silently seconded that thought as she watched demons from the second realm turning in circles, confused looks on their faces. A fae had just abducted their king. Part of her expected them to all flee the battle in search of him, but a male stepped forwards, barked something in the demon tongue, and they set off again, charging forwards as if nothing had happened. Taryn looked back towards where they were heading. Her brother still stood outside the black tent, waiting. She could feel it as she stood on the side of the mountain, the gentle wind flowing over her exposed skin, and the light from the portal warming it. Tenak moved forwards, stopped, took another step towards the battle. He was itching to join in. It was only a matter of time before he took the sword from the black tent and wreaked havoc with it on the remaining warriors of her side. Time that she wouldn't squander. Every second he spent watching the battle unfold was a chance for her to sneak into his camp and steal his sword. Now that he had left his tent, the time had come for her to act. She turned away from the battle, and Blue followed her, caught her hand, and darkness embraced them, cold against her skin. When it evaporated, they were on the other side of the mountain range, within the border of the first realm of demons. Ready? Blue said beside her as he released her arm. Taryn nodded. Ready. She stepped forwards to give herself more room to shift. Blue grabbed her arm, pulled her into his, and kissed her, a brief, firm press of his lips that soothed her fear and her nerves, and spoke volumes about the feelings that flowed from him and into her through their bond. He was worried and he loved her. "Be careful," he breathed against her lips. She clutched his upper arms, nuzzled his nose with hers, and savored this brief moment of calm, putting it to memory. "You be careful too," she whispered back at him. He kissed her again, and she claimed his lips, couldn't stop herself from deepening it, desperate to take more from him, afraid that this would be the last time they kissed. She drew up her courage from her feet, sucked down a deep breath, and found the strength to step back from him. She had to do this. Her brother was a threat to everyone in hell, and potentially everyone in the mortal realm too. If he won this war, the power he would wield in hell would only satisfy him at first. It wouldn't be long before his hunger grew, and he turned his mad gaze on the mortal plane, finding a way to enter it and bring it to its knees before him. And then what? Would her brother attempt to covet the greatest treasure and claim heaven for himself? She fisted her hands at her sides, clenched her jaw, and silently vowed that would never happen. It ended here, this day. She willed the shift, and the ground dropped away as her body transformed. Her black paws seemed foreign to her, as if she was looking through another's eyes. Blue's dazzling eyes. She looked across at him as he towered beside her, a huge black dragon with 6 horns and enormous obsidian wings. His scales shimmered blue in the dying light of day as he turned his head towards her, his violet eyes locking on her. The softness in them spoke to her, told her of his love for her, and that he intended to remain close to her for as long as he could. Taryn looked back down at her own black scales. Strange. She had always longed to be a different color, to be a normal shade for a dragon rather than a two-tone one that drew attention to her. But now she missed seeing her violet scales and white chest. The black made her feel like someone else, someone not her. Blue had told her back at the castle after mating with her that he thought her hair and eyes beautiful, and she had blushed but hadn't quite believed him. Now as he gazed at her, raking his violet eyes over her, and she mourned the loss of her colors, she knew he had been telling the truth. He honestly thought her unusual coloring added to her beauty, and he didn't want her any other way. She no longer wanted herself any other way either. Blue had made her feel comfortable in her skin, and now she could see how much that unique coloring was a part of her. She stood out, but she no longer cared who stared at her, or if she drew the attention of others. She only cared about the way her mate looked at her, the desire and love that shone in his violet eyes whenever they rested on her, and how her appearance drew his attention to her. She beat her wings and he kicked off, taking to the air with grace that had her lingering a moment on the mountainside to watch him. He flapped his huge black wings, a lazy beat compared to the flustered ones he had used during his training, one that said he was comfortable with being a dragon now, a striking one at that. The sunlight caught his scales again, sending blue shimmering over the ridges of his snout and brow, and down the long lean line of his neck, and up his muscular wings. He flicked his tail, the heavy barbed tip cutting through the air, and tucked his back legs up against his stomach, streamlining his body. He let out a short cry, one she understood. Taryn launched into the air, obeying his order to follow her. She beat her wings, lifting herself to the same altitude as him, and fell into place beside him. He banked right and soared downwards towards the valley floor, and she followed, mirroring him. The wind buffeted her face, cool against her scales, and joy swept through her despite her crushing fear of what lay ahead. Blue gave a single hard beat of his wings as he reached the side of the curving mountain range and shot upwards only a few meters from the cragged black rocks. She could feel his joy as it flowed through their link, his excitement as he mastered flying and experienced the thrill that she felt whenever she flew. He gave another keening cry as he launched into the sky above the ridge, caught a thermal and twisted in the air, so his body pointed downwards again. He dropped fast, spinning through the air with his wings pinned back, and disappeared beyond the ridge. She followed him, somersaulting as she reached a crescendo on the thermal coming up off the mountain range, diving towards him as he soared down into the valley on the other side. Her senses sparked and she sharply looked right. 3 dragons, a red male, a gold male, and an emerald female. They were heading towards the camp, coming to join Tenak for the final stage of the battle. The bigger red male called and Blue answered, and Taryn thanked the gods for being on their side as her mate fell into line with the 3 dragons, joining their ranks. She hadn't expected to have cover like this, but she wasn't going to complain. It would be easier to slip into the camp if they looked as though they were part of incoming reinforcements. Taryn joined Blue, flying beside him, as close as she could get as her nerves began to get the better of her again. The tents came into view as they rounded a corner, sending her heart pounding as those nerves suddenly shot up. Blue looked across at her and made a low coughing noise through his fangs that was meant to reassure her, a sound reserved for mates. The red male turned his head her way, his amber eyes narrowing, and Blue's enormous head swiveled towards him. Blue growled, flashing his fangs, and darted left, slamming his big body against the male and knocking him into the gold dragon. The red male called, a sound of submission, and flew upwards, breaking away from them and dropping to the back to the emerald female. Taryn's blood burned hot. Her mate was powerful, and his display of dominance stirred the fire in her veins until she was aching for him again, unsatisfied need rolling back to a boil. Blue lifted his head, his 6 horns catching the golden light of evening coming from the elf kingdom, and roared, robbing her of breath as a shiver chased through her. Her senses sparked, warning her of eyes on them, and she diverted her gaze away from Blue, settling it back on the camp. Tenak. He watched their approach with a broad smile, folded his muscular arms across his bare chest, and she could feel his satisfaction as it ran through him. Her heart thundered now, beating so fast she felt dizzy. Blue brushed his wing across her belly, the swift caress causing 1,000 warm tingles to spread over her scales, his way of telling her that he was still there with her. They would be victorious. Rosalind's spell would hold, masking her scent and her color. They would find the sword. They would be victorious. Taryn told herself that on repeat, a mantra she used to settle her fears as they neared the camp. Tenak looked away from them as the emerald female came in to land, turning his focus back to the battle. He would want to join it soon. Time was running out. Several big demon males closed in around Tenak, speaking to him while he remained focused on the fight down in the valley. The gold dragon sat down and shifted back, the emerald female joining him. Taryn looked at the black tent. How was she meant to reach it and shift back to enter it without her brother noticing her? Blue provided the answer to that question. He landed hard, crushing one of the smaller tents and sending everyone in the area scattering as he turned with a roar and lashed out at the red dragon male. His front right paw snagged on the dragon's wing as he went to pass him, coming in to land with the others, and sent him crashing to the ground. The male reacted in an instant, shoving onto his paws and turning on Blue, snapping at him with his fangs. Blue reared back and pummeled the male with his front paws, long black talons raking over the male's scales as he tried to evade Blue. Tenak shouted something and stormed towards them. Taryn saw her chance and took it, silently thanking her mate for his diversion and sending a prayer to the gods that he wouldn't be found out or seriously hurt. She drifted overhead, unnoticed by her brother, and the moment he had his back to her, striding away from her with his demon entourage in tow, she pirouetted in the air and dove towards the ground. She shifted before hitting it, landing naked in a squat behind the black tent. Threw a glance to her right towards Blue where he still clashed with the red dragon, their wings beating the air and paws smashing against each other. She didn't bother to use her limited magic to clothe herself, fearing it would mess with Rosalind's enchantment. She tugged the black material of the back of the tent up and scrambled underneath it, her heart leaping around in her chest. The grunts and snarls of the fight grew dimmer, and she shoved to her feet, her gaze flying around the tent. The sword had to be here somewhere. She checked every wooden trunk that lined the circular wall, threw the piles of cushions that formed a bed aside, scattering them in all directions, and huffed as she didn't find it. She closed her eyes, drew down a breath to steady herself, and then pulled the air in through her nose. The sword was here somewhere. She could smell it. Taryn opened her eyes, and the sound from the fight between Blue and the red dragon grew louder. Tenax barked orders, rising above the thuds of flesh meeting flesh. She scoured the room again and then shut her eyes, focused on her dragon instincts, and tapped into them. The sword was here. The sword was treasure, the most beautiful treasure, the ultimate treasure. Her senses tingled, her feet drawn towards something in the far corner, near the open flap at the front of the tent. She opened her eyes, everything around her shimmering as her desire for treasure took hold. Treasure. She obeyed her feet, allowing them to carry her towards it, lost in the desire running through her, the excitement and need. She was close. The treasure would be hers. She squatted in front of a low, long black box. Her hands shook as she reached for the gold clasp on the polished stone lid. She flicked it open with her thumb, held her breath as she raised the lid. That breath shot from her as her hungry gaze fell on the black sword. She ran trembling fingers down the blade, feeling the engraving on it, the power that flowed through it. Intoxicating. A roar sounded, closer now. The ultimate treasure. Not the sword, but the male who had birthed such a feral, powerful call. Her mate. She closed her fingers around the hilt of the blade, pulled it from the box, and rose to her feet. She raced to the back of the tent, tugged the black material up, and rolled under it, coming to her bare feet on the other side. Her entire body froze. Gaze slowly edged to her right, to the male there. Tenak's lips peeled back off his fangs as he snarled at her, his violet to white eyes flashing dangerously. He went from a walk to a sprint, long violet leather-clad legs eating up the distance between them. Her heart shot into overdrive. Blue reared up behind him and swept his left paw down, caught her brother in his side just as he closed in on her and sent him flying across the camp and slamming face first into the stone wall of one of the abandoned buildings. Before she could say or do anything, that same paw closed around her and lifted her off the ground. Blue tucked her against his chest, cradling her as his heavy footfall shook the earth and Tenak roared in the distance. The hairs on the back of her neck rose on end, and she didn't need to see to know her brother had shifted. Blue snarled and launched into the air, his huge black wings beating it hard as he tried to gain some distance between them and her brother. Taryn clutched the sword, pulse pounding as she called her violet leathers and white corset and her boots. As Blue banked, she looked back in the direction they had come, and her eyes widened as she saw not only Tenak after them, but the three other dragons too. The red male and emerald female broke away from Tenak, coming around to flank Blue. Blue snarled, jowls peeling back off his razor-sharp teeth, and dove, twisting in the air at the same time to drop beneath them. He straightened at the last second, spread his wings, and glided over the heads of the warriors clashing on the battlefield. In the distance, the garrison came into view. It stuttered, darkness flickering over it before the world came back. Blue snarled, and she felt his frustration, knew the cause of it. He had tried to teleport with her, but he wasn't strong enough to use his portal when he was in such a large form. He jerked forwards, a pained cry tearing from between his teeth, and dropped hard. He pulled his paw up, pressing her against his neck, and she shrieked when she came face to face with her brother. His enormous violet eyes narrowed on her as he sank his fangs into Blue's left flank and dug the talons of his front paws into his wing membranes. Pain exploded across her back as they crashed together, hitting the ground hard and rolled. Blue lost his grip on her, and the world twisted around her as she flew through the air, tumbling and turning. He snarled and flashed across her vision, a broken image of him shifting back. The pain. Her brother had bitten him to drive him back into his weaker form. Taryn grunted and cried out as she slammed into the ground and tumbled across it. The sword she clutched stabbed into her right thigh, sending white-hot fire blistering across her flesh from that point. The scent of blood filled her nostrils. She growled as she came to a halt face down on the grass, the tip of the black blade still sticking into her thigh, the angle of it pulling at the wound. She rolled onto her back and bellowed as she pulled it free of her flesh, breathed hard as she let it fall to her side together with her arms and fought the pain back. The sound of the battle was dim in her ears, her senses telling her they had landed a good distance from it, in a clearing in the valley. A roar curled around her. Her mate. Taryn rolled onto her front, pressed her hands into the grass, and pushed herself up. Blood pumped from the wound on her thigh. She gritted her teeth, grasped the sword, and shoved onto her feet, wobbling as her entire leg burned beneath her weight. She had to fight. Her hazy vision cleared as she blinked, revealing the brutal fight between Blue and her brother. The 3 dragons on her brother's side circled lazily overhead, watching the 2 warriors as they clashed, both in their mortal forms. A mighty war cry off to her right and the sound of thundering footsteps said they wouldn't be alone for long. The battle was coming to them. Taryn's grip on the sword tightened and she kicked off, heart filled with resolve and every instinct she possessed screaming at her to protect her mate. Blue clashed hard with Tenak, sending her brother staggering backwards, and lashed out with the serrated claws of his black armor. Tenak leaped back, barely evading the tips of them, and kicked off the moment he landed, throwing himself at Blue while he was still following through with the strike. Her brother slammed into his side, driving him down, and landed on top of him on the ground. Her mate threw his head to his right, dodging the punch coming at his face. Tenak's fist smashed into the earth, and her brother snarled as he drew his arm back and struck again. Blue growled and bucked up, sending her brother off balance. Tenak fell to his left, tried to right himself, but it was too late. Her mate was already breaking free from beneath him. Blue tackled Tenak, landing on top of him now and gaining the upper hand, until the red dragon swooped and forced him to roll off Tenak to evade his massive paw as it swiped at him. Blue's head shot up, and he snarled through his fangs at the male. The dragon turned in the air, dove right back at him. Blue disappeared, leaving a shimmering ghost of him behind that the talons of the dragon disturbed as they raked through it. A hot shiver coursed through her when Blue appeared behind her. She ran at Tenak, raising the sword as she roared a battle cry of her own. Strength flowed through her, determination that made her blood run hot and her courage rise. She would end this now. Tenak's head lifted, his violet to white eyes wild with a hunger for violence. Thick ribbons of blood painting the right side of his face and dripping down his bare chest to soak into the waist of his purple leathers. He shoved to his feet and his gaze swung her way, landed right on hers. Familiar eyes that gained an edge of sorrow as they locked with hers. All of her strength left her, and she stumbled to a halt just meters from him, her hands shaking, rattling the black blade that suddenly felt too heavy in her grip. It dropped to her side, her shoulders slumping as she stared into her brother's eyes. Her brother. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at him, fighting to convince herself to move, to do what was right and end him, and spare all of hell his wrath. Blue's steady gaze on her heated her back as the sound of battle fell away, silence stretching around her, and she felt only her mate and her brother on her senses. Her future was behind her, not in front of her. Her past stood there, a male she had loved once, but no longer. It was hard to force herself to accept that as she stared at him, caught in his gaze. Such a familiar gaze. Such familiar eyes. Those eyes had laughed at her, had shown her the deepest love and greatest affection, had comforted her when she had hurt and lifted her heart again, restoring her faith in the world whenever it had faltered. The tears filling hers blurred her vision, and she blinked to clear it, drew down a breath to steady her heart, pushed against the tide of the memories that felt as if it was going to carry her away, sweeping her back to her past rather than forwards to the future she wanted with all of her heart. That future stood behind her, waiting for her to claim it. With the stroke of a sword, it would be hers. She tried to move her hand, to raise the blade that felt so heavy in it, and claim that future she wanted with her mate, putting her past to rest. But it refused to respond as Tenak turned to face her. Her brother. Taryn looked down at the sword and then up into Tenak's eyes. She wavered, torn between dropping the blade and using it against him, her heart on fire as she battled the pain ripping her apart. A roar sounded behind her. Darkness rushed past her on black wings. Chapter 38. Tenak shifted in an instant, becoming a dragon and rearing onto his hind legs just as Blue hit him hard in the chest, sending them both to the ground in a tangle of wings. Blue didn't give him a chance to lash out at him. He struck hard, sinking his fangs into the white line down the front of Tenak's long neck, puncturing his scales and tearing a pained roar from him. Terran's hurt pounded in Blue's veins and beat in his heart, driving him on. He hadn't been able to stand there and watch her suffering, to sit back while she wrestled with herself, torn and hurting. When the pain in her heart had grown so fierce, it had brought tears to his own eyes. He had known exactly what he had to do. He had to deal with her brother for her. He couldn't allow her to fight Tenak, because he knew it would destroy her. At the risk of her despising him forever, he would fight her brother and would end him. Tenak rolled with him, pinning him to the ground. The male beat his wings, driving his full weight into Blue's stomach and pushing the air from his lungs. Blue snarled and lashed out at him with his tail. The barbed tip sank deep into Tenak's hindquarters, and he yanked it back, slicing through Tenak's violet scales and ripping a pained cry from him. The second Tenak threw his head back on that cry, Blue struck again, snapping at his chest and scratching long grooves in his thicker white scales with his fangs. Tenak shoved off him, beating his broad wings to lift him into the air. He called to his 3 dragons, and they dove towards him, coming to his aid. No damned way Blue was going to let the bastard escape. He lumbered onto his feet and kicked off, reached out with his left paw and just missed Tenak's front right one. Tenak spotted him and snarled, and the barbed tip of his tail smashed into Blue's wings, slashing the black membrane. He dropped hard, beat his wings to try to decelerate, but it was difficult when his left wing had taken heavy damage. His hind paws hit the ground hard just as Tenak's army of demons and fae reached them, and Blue growled as they hacked at his paws and tail. He turned on them and lashed out with his tail, sending males flying in a wave through the air as it plowed through their ranks. Terrified screams rang out from them, and he turned his head and snapped at them, caught one between his jaws and bit down hard. The male's garbled cry cut short as one of Blue's fangs punched a hole right through him, and the 2 parts of his body dropped from his jaw, spiraling towards the demons at his feet, spraying blood all over them. Blue kicked off again, weathering the storm of swords and spears that pierced his scales, gaining enough height to evade them. Some of the fae hurled spears at him. He went to turn on them. An invisible wave cut through the horde, sending them shooting into the air, coming down hard on their own ranks. Blue cast a glance towards the source of the blast. Vale stood just in front of Terran, his clawed hand outstretched before him, his violet eyes narrowed on the enemies he had just sent flying. Those eyes lifted to Blue, and Blue nodded his thanks and twisted away, beating his wings as he went after Tenak and the 3 dragons. The blood sliding over his black scales cooled as the wind rushed over him, stealing more of his strength as it made him aware of his injuries. His wounded wing ached as he flew, but he gritted his teeth and pushed onwards through the pain. Behind him, the battle grew distant, becoming a murmur in his ears. Ahead of him, Tenak turned. Blue snarled through his fangs and pinned his gaze on the bastard. Big mistake. He cried out as pain splintered across his right side like lightning, searing his bones. The red dragon snapped at him, and he threw his head left, barely evading the blow aimed for his throat. Talons raked over his shoulder and his right wing, tearing through the membrane. The male dragon growled as he beat his wings, sending Blue spiraling into a freefall with him. Blue fought him, lashing out with his fangs, trying to seize the male's throat to pull him away. He snarled as he managed to get hold of the male. Too late. White-hot fire blazed over his left side as he hit the ground, the weight of the red dragon landing on top of him, emptying his lungs on impact. His vision darkened and then slowly returned in time for him to see Tenak diving towards him, talons poised to strike. The red dragon kicked off, claws tearing free of Blue's flesh, and Tenak hit Blue hard, sending darkness shooting across his vision and his mind. Numbness swept in, a strange sort of emptiness that rang alarm bells in Blue's head. He fought the encroaching unconsciousness and twisted beneath Tenak as the male rolled him onto his back, an agonized bellow tearing from between his clenched teeth as his wings bent awkwardly beneath him, bones snapping. Blue mustered all of his strength, pushed beyond the limit and reached for more. One last stand. One last shot. He scrabbled at Tenak's chest, clawed the bastard and tried to get his talons between the plates of white armor protecting his heart. He was going to tear it out. The tip of his right talons caught on a crack in Tenak's scales, and his paw hung there limply no matter how fiercely he tried to convince his talons to press between the scales and plunge into his chest. Gods damn it! Weakness infested every inch of his body, throbbing among the pain, mocking him. Tenak loomed above him, violet scales dark in the low light of evening, but his purple eyes shining like fire. Thoughts of his mate filled Blue's mind and his aching heart, thoughts of the future he had wanted to claim for them on this battlefield, a future that was slipping through his weakening grasp, replaced with only darkness, the death that shone in Tenak's eyes. Gods damn it all to hell. It couldn't end here, with him so close to securing the future he had dreamed of since he had been a boy, one where he would live forever with his Kiara. Could it? Would fate be so cruel? Get your fucking paws off him! Blue didn't have a chance to pull his wits together enough to recognize the feminine voice that had snarled those words in the dragon tongue before a blast of white-blue light blinded him, seared his scales, and felt as if it was setting him on fire as it rushed past him. A pained roar shattered his eardrums. His own? He felt as if he was burning to ashes in the fiery light. The weight that had been pressing down on him lifted, and the light faded, the world going dim for a few seconds before his vision adjusted and came back, revealing he still had all four paws when he was sure he must have lost some in order to make him cry like that. The scent of singed flesh, accompanied by low whimpers, drew his hazy focus towards a point a short distance from him. To the violet and white dragon who was limping backwards, a pawless right arm tucked against his white chest, and left wing grotesquely bent and dragging across the grass. Where the right wing should have been, there was only a smoking stump. Pale wisps curled from the shorn white horns on the right side of the dragon's head, too, wafting in the breeze that gently swept across the land. Everything slowly fell into place as a female came into view, her violet to white hair billowing in the breeze, fluttering around her slender bare shoulders as she advanced on the wounded dragon, fire raging in her striking eyes. She held a black sword point down at her side, and swirls of white-blue light rose off the blade, curling from it and catching the breeze. They brushed across the violet leathers that tightly encased her long, slender legs, drifting up towards the small strip of toned stomach exposed between her trousers and her white leather corset. Recognition sparked inside him, drove the haziness from his mind as his heart beat quicker and his instincts roared to the fore. His mate, his Kiara, his forever. She didn't take her eyes off Tenak as she advanced on him, no trace of sympathy in her eyes now, or fear in her blood as she held her head high. Tenak shifted back, snarling and growling in agony as his body shrank and distorted. He grunted as the transformation finished and clutched his right arm, pain written in every strained line of his blood-stained face. Crimson ran down the right side of it, darkening his short hair, the smell of it strong in the still evening air. Silence reigned around them as he faced off against Terran, both Blue's enemies and his allies collectively holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen. "Sister," Tenak said in a throaty murmur edged with pain, and reached his left hand towards her, his gaze imploring. Her face blackened, but a spark of agony lit her eyes and called to Blue. He shifted back, wanting to fulfill the desire to go to her, to stand at her side where she needed him in this her darkest and most challenging hour. The shift was quick to come, but the pain that tore through him as he transformed, his flesh splitting open where his scales had been wounded, stripped what little strength he had gathered, and all he could do was lay on the ground and watch, breathing through the agony as Terran faced off against her brother. Her grip on the sword tightened. "I stopped being your sister the day you stopped being my brother," she bit out, and flashed sharp teeth at Tenak. "But you made yourself my sworn enemy when you chose to attack my mate." Tenak's eyes leaped to Blue and then back to her. Terran snarled. You brought this fate upon yourself!" Her brother's eyes shot wide. Taryn swept the blade to her other side and then slashed upwards. A brilliant arc of pure white-blue light erupted from it, flying through the air towards her brother. Tenak didn't have a chance to loose a cry, didn't have a chance to even open his mouth or move a muscle. The beam reached him in the space of a heartbeat and engulfed him. His shadow hovered in the light for a second before it disintegrated, and the arc streaked across the land beyond him, leaving a deep scar in the earth, leaving nothing behind. Taryn stood motionless, her eyes locked on the point where her brother had been, her pain ricocheting around inside Blue together with his own, hers burning so fiercely that it eclipsed his. Long seconds passed, and slowly her face morphed from darkness through to anguish and onwards towards relief. The sword dropped from her hand, struck the earth point first, and wavered there as she turned away from it and from the dark scar across the valley. The relief that he felt in her disappeared when her violet to white eyes landed on him, and tears filled them as she ran towards him, her beautiful expression relaying all of her love for him together with the link that would tie them together forever. She sank to her knees beside him, her heart thundering in his ears, her lips moving soundlessly as she checked him over, her dark eyebrows furrowed as her gaze flickered between his and his body. He mustered enough strength to send a mental command to his armor, and the small black scales rippled over his body. Pain shot through him in their wake, and he grunted and clenched his teeth against it. The tears on Taryn's lashes spilled over, slipping down her cheeks and cutting through the dirt and blood. She frowned at him, and he knew that later when they were alone, she was going to give him hell for what he had done. But all that mattered right now was how good it felt to have her fussing over him, her hands on his body and her heart calling out to him through their bond, telling him everything she felt, all the love that filled her heart. "Why?" she croaked. Blue slowly raised his right hand, tensed his muscles to stop it from shaking, and brushed her hair behind her ear, curling his fingers around it and savoring how she leaned into his touch, seeking more from him. "Because you were hurting," he whispered. "I had to do something. I couldn't let you hurt like that." She closed her eyes, turned her face towards his hand, and brushed her lips across his palm. "And now I am still hurting. The sight of you fighting, you falling, the thought that you might get yourself killed just to protect me." She sighed and looked back at him, caressed his brow, and admonished him with her eyes. "I am stronger than you think, Blue. You do not have to fight my battles." He closed his eyes and relaxed against the cool grass, using the connection their touch formed to ease his pain with the knowledge that she was safe and it was over. When he opened his eyes again, hers were no longer chastising him. They shone with affection, mixed with worry, drifting over his body and pinpointing all of his injuries, even though his armor concealed them from her eyes. She could feel them echoing on her body just as he could feel hers. He never had been able to hide anything from her, never wanted to if he was honest. "I'm your mate, little dragon. I will always want to protect you." He sighed and cupped her cheek, and she looked back into his eyes, hers soft with understanding. It ran both ways. He wanted to protect her, and she wanted to protect him. An endless circle, as infinite as their love for each other. "I will always do whatever I have to in order to take away your pain and stop you from hurting." He sensed the lands around them emptying. Tenak sighed, quick to teleport or fly away as it became clear they had lost this battle. His side had emerged the victors. Because of Taryn. Her courage had done more than won the war. It had saved all of hell. His brave, strong, and beautiful little dragon. "And I will always do whatever I have to in order to protect you, and to take away your pain and stop you from hurting," she said in the dragon tongue, and raised her hand towards her face. He growled low in his throat as she caught her hair and swept it over her shoulder, pinning it to the back of her head, revealing the smooth column of her neck. Taryn placed her other arm beneath him, raised him up, and cradled him to her. He swiped his tongue over her throat, shuddered at the same time as she did, and closed his eyes as he sank his fangs into her. She moaned low in his ear, one that trembled and sent another shiver through him, had his body shooting hard in an instant despite his injuries. He gave a soft pull on her blood and shuddered all over again, as her blood hit his tongue and he swallowed a mouthful. It slid down his throat like warm ambrosia and spread fiery tendrils through him, ones that seemed to dull the pain wherever they touched. He had seen the effects of a mate's blood when Lauren had been injured and had fed from Olivia, but he hadn't realized how strongly it would affect him. Blue sank against her, taking sips of her blood, his strength slowly returning until he had enough to wrap his arms around her and hold her to him. She smoothed her hands over his back, her touch comforting. Beneath his armor, he felt the shallower wounds knitting together, and the deeper ones beginning to heal as Taryn's blood flowed through him, restoring his strength and sending his healing abilities into overdrive. She moaned against his ear, a strained one that she had tried to keep quiet but had slipped free and tensed. Her embarrassment flowed through him, and he wanted to tell her that she didn't have to be ashamed that she enjoyed the feel of his fangs in her throat. Only his senses came back online at that very moment, and it struck him that it wasn't shame that had made her tense and stifle her little groan of pleasure. It was the audience they had gained. He could feel Lauren and Vale nearby, Kingthorne and Sable with them, and at more of a distance was Queen Melia and Isla, and the entire army, most of them watching him feeding from Taryn. He reluctantly withdrew his fangs and lifted his head, shot Lauren a black look that he hoped conveyed how annoyed he was that his prince had chosen to hold court to the rest of the army just feet from him, when he had been sharing a private moment with his mate. Vale's lips curled into a wicked smile, but at least he had the decency to turn his back. Lauren just kept staring. Waiting, Blue realized for Taryn to emerge so he could thank her. His prince had damned awful timing. His presence was only made more annoying when Lauren held up a small teardrop glass vial with a leaf-shaped lid and raised his eyebrows as he waggled it. Medicine. Blue curled his lip in disgust, wanted to refuse his prince's silent order and tell him he would be fine with just Taryn's blood, but in the end heaved a sigh instead and accepted his fate and the imminent blast of pain he was about to experience, because he knew Taryn would feel better, brighter if he was healed. So he would bear the pain, just this once, for her. Blue eased her back and gave her a look that he hoped told her to go along with Lauren's plan to thank her. They would be alone again soon, just the two of them, the way it should be, the way he needed it to be. He pulled his legs up to his chest as she stood, concealing the evidence of his desire, and caught the small vial Lauren tossed to him. He popped the lid off with his thumb, steeled himself, and then knocked the liquid back. Fire blazed through him, and he gritted his teeth against the white-hot pain that felt as if it was ripping him apart in order to put him back together, refusing to let everyone around him hear him scream in agony. Taryn touched his knee, her caress comforting and soothing him as the pain began to ebb away, leaving him struggling to catch his breath. Her hand slipped from his knee, and he looked up at her as she awkwardly received a handshake from Lauren, and the cheers of the entire army gathered before her. Embarrassment blasted through their bond as she stood beside Lauren, all eyes on her, but hurt began to creep back in, pain that had Blue finding his feet and going to her. He caught her arm and pulled her away from the spotlight, looked over his shoulder at his princes as he walked with her across the valley. Vale nodded, tugged the black blade from the earth, and presented it to Lauren. Lauren took it and nodded at Blue, the look in his violet eyes telling him to take all the time they needed, and then he disappeared, leaving only a pulsing, shimmering outline of him behind. The entire battlefield emptied, everyone teleporting back to the garrison. There would be a celebration, but Blue didn't feel like rejoicing, not when the price of this victory had been high. He turned to Taryn and pulled her into his arms, enfolding her in them and holding her against his chest. He sent a mental command to his armor, clearing it from his chest and arms but leaving it covering his legs, wanting her to be comfortable as she rested against him. She trembled, her pain rising again, fiercely burning in her heart. The salty tang of tears filled the air as that pain got the better of her, and he sighed as he held her to him in silence, uncaring of time as it trickled past. He stroked her back, wishing there was something he could do to ease her pain as she sobbed in his arms, grieving for her brother. The sky was black by the time she emerged and swiped her palms across her cheeks to rub away her tears. He had hoped to spare her this pain, but in the end he had probably only added to it by getting himself wounded in the process. Blue eased back and sighed as he brushed his thumbs across her cheeks beneath her eyes, capturing the last of her tears. She drew in a deep, shuddering breath, exhaled it hard, and raised her eyes to his. This wouldn't be the last time she cried over her brother and what she had done, but he would be there to hold her whenever she grieved, to tell her how much he loved her, and that in time her pain would fade until she had forgotten it and her brother was only a memory. He would always be there for her. She fingered his chest, brushing their tips across a pink round fang mark on his right pectoral that one of the dragons had left on him. "Damn you for being so noble and throwing yourself into my fight," she said, but there was no trace of anger in her words, only love and fear. He had frightened her. It hadn't been his intention, but he had. He never wanted to frighten her again, not when it clearly hurt her. "I just wanted to protect you," he whispered, his eyes holding hers, drinking in all the love they showed. Her love for him. It was deep and endless, and God's, it was beautiful. Everything he had ever dreamed and so much more. "I didn't want you to suffer, and I can feel that you are." She lowered her eyes to his chest. "I cannot deny that. Killing Tenak, I feel as if I am bleeding inside. But I do not feel empty as I had expected." She raised her gaze back to meet his and carefully laid her palms on his chest, warming him. "Because my connection with you is there within me, filling me with warmth and light, flooding me with your love." Blue lowered his head and caught her lips in a soft kiss, one designed to tell her just how deeply that love ran, and that it was endless, a torrent that would never stop flowing. He sighed as he broke away from her lips, held her face in his palms, and breathed her in, still struggling to believe that she was finally his, even when he could feel and smell her, could see her and hear her words of love ringing in his mind, and still taste her blood on his tongue, blood that she had given him to heal, despite her own wounds. He closed his eyes and focused on their link, delved into it and flowed into her, sought the deepest of her wounds and seized them. He gritted his teeth and grunted as pain erupted on his body where those wounds were on hers, strongest on his thigh, and she gasped, broke free of his hold, severing his connection and halting the process. She huffed. "I did not give you my blood so you could take my wounds. They are mine to heal." Blue opened his eyes and rolled his right shoulder in a shrug, refusing to apologize for what he had tried to do. She had eased his pain by giving her blood to him, and he had only wanted to erase hers. Besides, the medicine had healed him, and he was strong enough to take on some of her wounds for her. It was either that or make her take the medicine herself, and he had caught the look in her eyes when he had been fighting the pain after taking it, the one that had said there was no way in hell she was going to subject herself to it. Maybe if he gave her blood, it would help her heal. He wasn't sure how dragons worked in that respect. His gaze drifted down to the puncture marks on her neck, crimson welled in them, beads that trembled on the brink of falling, and he groaned as he realized that he had been so concerned with everyone watching them that he had forgotten to seal them. He lifted his eyes to hers, held his hand out to her, and waited. Taryn touched her neck. Her fingers came away blood-stained, and her eyes darkened as she stared at it. Not with anger or pain, with desire. She placed her hand into his, allowed him to pull her flush against him, and tipped her head back as he wrapped his lips around the wound on her throat. She moaned as he gave a shallow pull, her hands jumping up to clutch his shoulders and her fingers digging into his muscles. Blue groaned against her neck, the need he had been fighting for what felt like forever, now spiraling back out of control as her sweet taste flooded his mouth, and the connection between them grew even stronger. "You need to rest and heal," she said in a voice thick with desire, that told him resting and healing wasn't the only thing on her mind involving a bed. "I'm healed, I swear." But I will rest later if it will alleviate your worry. Right now, I just need you." He whispered against her flesh and licked the wounds, shuddered as heat shot through him. "You need me too." She didn't deny that, just moaned in his ear and melted against him, her pain fading into nothingness as desire roared to the foreground. Need they had denied too long. "I do, but—" She sounded breathless already, panting softly as he tongued her neck and lowered his hands to her backside. "You must rest." He knew that he should, that he was hardly in any position to be considering the things running through his mind, images of him and Taryn naked and tangled together. His body was healed, but he was still weak. He tried to rein them in. Taryn didn't help matters. "Perhaps we could rest together." Dear gods. He wouldn't be doing any resting if she shared a sickbed with him, that was for sure. He growled and kissed her throat, following the line of it up to her ear, and she moaned when he sucked the lobe between his lips. "Or we could rest later," she cried and clutched him, claws pressing into his shoulders. "Don't stop doing that." "I don't intend to." He husked into her ear, and she shivered against him, a little moan escaping her. "I intend to keep doing this forever." She stilled in his arms, leaned back, and searched his face in the low light. "Forever?" He nodded and righted her, and smoothed his hand across her cheek as he sensed the trickle of fear that went through her, the need for reassurance and to hear him say it all over again. Although desire reigned, pain still lingered in her heart, born of losing someone she loved, and that hurt clawed at her whether she felt it or not, placed doubt in her head that he would do all in his power to extinguish. "I told you, Taryn, I love you, and I'm yours, and I will always be yours. Nothing will ever change that." "Always," she echoed, a distant edge to her soft voice. "I like the sound of that." Not as much as he did. She leaned in close, tiptoed, and brushed her lips across his. "I will love you forever, for always, for all eternity, Blue. And I will always be yours, and nothing will ever change that." Nothing. He liked that word almost as much as the word always and forever. Nothing would stand between them. Nothing would keep them apart. Nothing would change their feelings. They would always be together. They would always love each other. They would always look forwards. He dropped his head and kissed his mate, losing himself in her as he always would, losing track of time as they stood together on the battlefield, where they had slayed their pasts to set free their future. A future that began as his lips danced with hers and she held him tight, and their love flowed through their bond, completing each other. The clock in Velestrum struck the hour, bells ringing 12 times in the distance, and filled him with warmth as he held Taryn closer, his heart close to bursting as something dawned on him. Yesterday had been the end of their past, a time that would fade into memory, put to rest for eternity. Today was the start of their forever. The end. This has been Possessed by a Dark Warrior, Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Copyright 2016-2017 by Felicity Heaton. Production copyright 2017 by Felicity Heaton.